Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I decided to take a break from my stressful job and spend a week hiking the Appalachian Trail. I'd been hiking for years and always found peace in nature. The solitude was something I craved, especially after months of relentless work pressure. I planned my route meticulously, making sure to stay on the main trail for safety, but I also allowed for some detours to explore less trodden paths. On the fourth day, I came across a narrow path that branched off the main trail. It was barely noticeable, hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. Curious and eager for some adventure, I decided to take it. The path was rough and uneven, but I didn't mind. It felt like I was the first person to walk it in years. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon a small, hidden clearing. It was a strange sight. In the middle of the clearing, there was a group of people, about 5 of them. They were gathered around what looked like a freshly dug hole. At first, I thought they might be hikers like me, but then I noticed the shovels and the dark, heavy bags they were handling. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they were burying something. I stood frozen, watching them. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a rifle slung over his shoulder, noticed me. Our eyes locked, and I knew I was in trouble. Without thinking, I turned and ran back the way I came. I could hear shouts behind me, followed by the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The path I had taken was rough, and I stumbled several times, but adrenaline kept me going. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder and more frantic. The man with the rifle was leading the chase, barking orders at the others. I knew I had to lose them. I darted off the path and into the dense forest, hoping the thick vegetation would slow them down. I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't stop. I pushed through branches and undergrowth, my clothes getting torn and my skin scratched. I just kept running. After what felt like an eternity, I found a small cave hidden behind a cluster of rocks. I squeezed inside, hoping they wouldn't find me. I tried to catch my breath, my whole body trembling with fear. I could still hear them searching, their voices echoing through the forest. They were angry, and I knew they wouldn't give up easily. I stayed hidden in the cave until the voices faded away. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out and continued moving. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. They knew I was out here, and they would keep looking until they found me. For the next few hours, I used every bit of my hiking and survival knowledge to evade them. I stayed off the main paths, moved silently through the forest, and kept an eye out for any signs of them. I was exhausted, but I couldn't afford to rest. I needed to put as much distance between us as possible. As night fell, I found a large tree with low branches and climbed up. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but it was safer than being on the ground. I nestled in between the branches, trying to stay warm and hidden. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of what they were burying and why they were so desperate to catch me. The next morning, I carefully climbed down and continued my escape. I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. I knew that water sources often led to civilization or at least a more recognizable part of the trail. By midday, I came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it offered some shelter. I cautiously approached and peered inside. It was empty, just a few broken pieces of furniture and a dusty floor. I decided to rest there for a while and plan my next move. As I was sitting in the cabin, I heard voices again. My heart sank. They had found me. I quickly hid behind a large cabinet, hoping they wouldn't look inside the cabin. The voices grew louder, and I could hear them talking about finding the hiker. My pulse quickened. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. Two of the men entered, their eyes scanning the room. I stayed as still as possible, my heart pounding in my ears. One of them walked right past me, so close I could smell the sweat on his clothes. They searched the cabin but didn't find me. After a few tense minutes, they left, cursing and arguing. I waited until I was sure they were gone before emerging from my hiding spot. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to keep moving. I followed the stream for the rest of the day, constantly looking over my shoulder. By nightfall, I was completely exhausted. I found a dense thicket and crawled inside to rest. I barely slept, too afraid they would find me. Early the next morning, I continued my journey. The stream eventually led me to a larger river, which I recognized from my map. I was close to a ranger station. With renewed hope, I followed the river until I finally reached the ranger station. I stumbled inside, dirty and exhausted, and told the rangers everything. They took me seriously and immediately called for backup. The rangers escorted me back to the nearest town, where I was able to clean up and rest. They promised to investigate the area and find the men who had been chasing me. I was grateful to be safe but shaken by the experience. I never found out what they were burying, but I knew it was something they didn't want anyone to see. It took me a long time to feel safe in the woods again. The memory of that terrifying chase still haunts me, but I'm grateful to have made it out alive. I decided to take a solo road trip across the country. I needed a break from my routine life and some adventure. One night, I was driving through a desolate stretch of rural Texas. It was late, and there were no cars in sight. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, disappearing into the dark horizon. Suddenly, my car started making strange noises, and then it just died. I coasted to the side of the road, my heart sinking. I tried starting it again, but it was no use. With no cell service, I felt completely alone and vulnerable. I sat there, hoping a car would pass by soon. Minutes turned into hours, and still, there was no sign of anyone. Just when I thought I was stuck there all night, I saw headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as a pickup truck pulled up behind my car. A middle-aged man got out and walked towards me. He seemed kind and concerned, asking what happened. I told him my car had broken down, and he offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of sitting there alone in the dark was too much. I thanked him and got into his truck. As we drove, I felt a bit more at ease. He started asking me questions about my trip, where I was headed, and why I was traveling alone. At first, it seemed like small talk, but then his questions became more personal. He asked if I had a boyfriend, if anyone knew where I was, and how long I planned to be on the road. His tone was off, making me uneasy. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but he kept returning to those personal questions. Then, he made a comment that sent chills down my spine. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be out here all alone. You never know what kind of people you might run into. The unease in my stomach turned into fear when he took a wrong turn onto a deserted dirt road. I asked him why we weren't sticking to the main road, and he said it was a shortcut. But something about his tone and the look in his eyes made me realize he was lying. I glanced around, looking for any sign of civilization, but there was nothing but darkness and open land. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a way out. I had to get out of this truck. I noticed his window was down, and the door handle was within reach. I needed to act fast. I told him I needed to use the bathroom, hoping he'd stop. He just laughed and kept driving. Panic set in, and I knew I had to escape. Without thinking, I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. The truck was moving fast, but I had no choice. I jumped out, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to get up and run. I could hear the truck screech to a halt behind me, and then his angry shouts filled the air. I ran into the darkness, not knowing where I was going. My only thought was to get away. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled several times, but I kept moving. I could hear him running after me, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I saw a cluster of trees up ahead and headed towards them. I hoped they would provide some cover. I ducked behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath. I could hear him cursing and calling out for me. I stayed as still as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes passed, and his voice grew more distant. I waited until I was sure he was gone before I moved. My heart was still racing, and I knew I needed to find help. I walked through the trees, trying to stay hidden. The darkness was suffocating, and every sound made me jump. Eventually, I saw a faint light in the distance. I headed towards it, hoping it was a house or some kind of building. As I got closer, I realized it was a small farmhouse. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I approached cautiously, knocking on the door. An elderly couple answered, and I quickly explained what happened. They let me in, gave me water, and called the police. I felt a wave of relief as I sat on their couch, but my mind was still racing. The police arrived and took my statement. They assured me they would search for the man and get me to safety. The couple let me stay with them until the police could arrange transportation for me. I was grateful, but the fear and adrenaline made it hard to relax. The next day, the police drove me to a nearby town where I could get a bus back home. They promised to keep me updated on their search. It took me a long time to shake off the fear of that night. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't jumped out of the truck. Mike and I decided to camp in a remote part of the national forest, far from the usual spots. We wanted peace and quiet, away from the crowds. We hiked for hours, enjoying the untouched nature around us. By late afternoon, we found a perfect clearing to set up our tent. The spot was serene, with the sound of a nearby stream and the rustling of leaves. We spent the day exploring, collecting firewood, and taking pictures. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the campsite, looking forward to a cozy evening by the fire. When we got back, the sight of our ransacked tent stopped us in our tracks. Everything was scattered, and our food was gone. At first, we thought it might have been animals, but then we saw the messages carved into the trees around us. Words like leave and die were gouged into the bark, deep and menacing. A chill ran down my spine. Mike tried to stay calm, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We checked our gear and found our phones were dead. We had no way to call for help. We decided to pack up and leave, but night was falling fast. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. We heard rustling in the bushes. Mike grabbed a stick, and I held a flashlight, but the light flickered and died. Panic set in. We were not alone. We heard whispers and low chuckles echoing through the dark. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We started moving quickly, heading back the way we came, but the forest looked different in the dark. It was easy to get turned around. We walked for what felt like hours, but the sounds of our pursuers followed us. Branches snapped, and footsteps rustled behind us, always just out of sight. Mike suggested we hide and wait them out, but the thought of sitting in the dark, knowing they were out there, was terrifying. We kept moving, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. The fear was suffocating, each shadow seeming to hide a threat. Eventually, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was shelter. We rushed inside and barricaded the door with whatever we could find. The cabin was musty, and the windows were broken, but it felt like a small reprieve. We sat in the dark, listening. The whispers grew louder, and we heard footsteps circling the cabin. Mike and I held each other, too scared to speak. Hours passed like this, every creak and groan of the cabin making us jump. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, followed by sinister laughter. They were toying with us. We had to get out. Mike found an old map in the cabin, showing a road a few miles away. We decided to make a run for it at dawn, hoping the light would give us some advantage. The night was endless. Neither of us slept. As the first light of dawn crept through the broken windows, we prepared to leave. We listened carefully and didn't hear anything outside. We opened the door cautiously and stepped out, hearts pounding. We moved quickly, sticking to the plan. The forest was quiet, but the silence was unnerving. We stayed alert, looking for any sign of our pursuers. The road seemed like it was a lifetime away, but we kept pushing forward. Finally, we saw the dirt road ahead. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. As we stepped onto the road, a truck appeared in the distance. We hid in the bushes, watching as it got closer. It slowed down as it approached, and we saw the men from the forest in the back, armed and looking for us. We stayed hidden until the truck passed, then made our way along the road in the opposite direction. We walked for miles, exhausted and scared, but determined to get away. The road eventually led us to a small ranger station. We stumbled inside, telling the ranger everything. He called for help, and soon we were safe, surrounded by people who believed our story. The men from the forest were never found, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get home. The experience changed us. We used to love the isolation of the wilderness, but now it held a darker memory. I planned a solo camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains to clear my head. The stress at work was getting unbearable, and I needed some time alone in nature. After a long day of hiking, I found a good spot to set up camp. The weather forecast said there might be a storm, but I figured I could handle it. As night fell, the wind picked up, and the sky turned dark. The storm hit harder than I expected, with thunder and lightning shaking the ground. My tent wasn't holding up well, and I needed better shelter. I remembered passing an old, rundown cabin about a mile back. I packed my essentials and headed there, hoping it would provide some protection. The cabin looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. I hesitated but decided it was better than staying out in the storm. Inside, it was dark and musty. I found a spot near the fireplace and set up my sleeping bag. As I moved around, my flashlight caught something strange, a half-eaten meal on a table, still fresh. Someone had been here recently. My heart raced. I checked the rest of the cabin and found more signs of recent activity: clothes, a knife, and a makeshift bed. The storm outside grew louder, and the thought of going back out seemed impossible. I decided to stay, hoping whoever was here wouldn't return tonight. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I tried to sleep but was on edge. Then, I heard it, footsteps outside, crunching through the wet leaves. I held my breath, listening. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure entered, silhouetted by the lightning flashes. I stayed still, trying to stay unnoticed. The figure moved around, checking the room. I could see he was tall and had a rough look about him. He stopped at the table, noticing the things I had moved. He stiffened and turned, scanning the room more carefully. I hid behind an old piece of furniture, praying he wouldn't find me. He walked closer, and I could see his face now, unkempt beard, wild eyes. He was muttering to himself, something about not wanting to be disturbed. The thunder roared, masking the sound of my pounding heart. Suddenly, he froze, turning his head sharply towards my hiding spot. I clenched my flashlight, ready to defend myself. He took a step closer, then another. He was almost upon me when a loud crack of thunder made him jump. He cursed and moved away, back towards the door. I exhaled quietly, thinking I might be safe. But then, he turned and locked the door, trapping us both inside. He sat down at the table, eyeing the room suspiciously. I knew I had to get out before he noticed me. Slowly, I began to inch towards the window, hoping to slip out unseen. Just as I reached the window, it creaked loudly under my weight. His head snapped towards me, and our eyes met. There was a moment of shocked silence before he lunged at me. I scrambled to open the window, but it was stuck. His hand grabbed my arm, and I twisted free, knocking over a chair in the process. He shouted angrily, coming at me again. I managed to push the window open just enough to squeeze through. I dropped to the ground outside, rain soaking me instantly. I ran blindly into the woods, not daring to look back. I could hear him shouting, but the storm swallowed his words. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed under a tree, trying to catch my breath. I had no idea where I was or if he was still following me. I listened intently, but all I heard was the storm. Eventually, the storm began to die down. I gathered my strength and started moving again, trying to find my way back to the main trail. Every snap of a twig made me jump, fearing he was right behind me. The forest felt like it was closing in, every shadow a potential threat. By dawn, I stumbled upon the trail. Exhausted and soaked, I kept moving, knowing I had to get as far away from that cabin as possible. It took hours, but I finally reached a ranger station. I burst in, babbling about the man in the cabin. The rangers took me seriously and went to investigate. They found the cabin, but the man was gone. All his things were still there, including the knife and the half-eaten meal. They told me I was lucky to be alive. I never found out who he was or why he was there. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the Pine Barrens to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I thought some time in nature would do me good. I set up my tent in a secluded spot, far from any trails or other campsites. The first day was peaceful. I hiked, took photos, and enjoyed the quiet. As the sun began to set, I built a small campfire and settled down with a book. The sky turned a deep orange, and the sounds of the forest surrounded me. It was perfect until I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw a man standing about 50 yards away, just beyond the light of my fire. He wore a mask, one of those plain white ones with no features. He was just standing there, watching me. My heart started to race. I called out to him, asking if he needed help or if he was lost. He didn't respond, didn't move. I stood up, trying to show I wasn't afraid, and took a step towards him. That's when he disappeared into the trees, moving so quickly it was like he vanished. I told myself it was probably just someone messing around, maybe another camper trying to scare me. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the masked man again. Hours passed, and I was starting to relax when I heard footsteps circling my campsite. They were slow, deliberate. I cracked my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped whenever I moved the light. My breath was shallow, and my hands were shaking. I couldn't stay here. I doused the fire and packed up my essentials. I decided to leave the tent and most of my gear, thinking I could come back for it later. I just needed to get out of there. As I started down the path, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I turned, and there he was, the masked man, standing on the edge of my campsite. He tilted his head, like he was studying me. I ran. The path was dark and uneven, and I stumbled several times. My flashlight flickered, adding to the terror. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening to match mine. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, praying I'd find the main trail or another camper. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every shadow looked like him, every sound was his footsteps. I came to a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath, listening. It was silent. Too silent. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my flashlight. There he was, standing at the edge of the clearing, closer than before. I backed away, but he took a step forward. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran again, deeper into the forest, away from the paths. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning. Eventually, I came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, hoping to hide. The cabin was small and musty, with broken furniture and dirt everywhere. I found a spot in the corner, behind an old table, and tried to quiet my breathing. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I heard footsteps outside, then the door creaking open. The masked man stepped inside, his presence filling the tiny cabin. He moved slowly, methodically, searching. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become invisible. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. He moved closer, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He paused near the table, and I held my breath. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and left, the door creaking shut behind him. I waited, afraid to move, until I was sure he was gone. When I finally emerged from the cabin, the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was approaching. I made my way back to my campsite, moving cautiously, listening for any sign of him. When I reached the site, it was trashed. My tent was slashed, my gear scattered. But there was no sign of the masked man. I gathered what I could and made my way back to my car. Every step felt like I was being watched, but I never saw him again. When I finally reached the safety of my car, I collapsed inside and locked the doors. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was miles away from the Pine Barrens. I don't know who he was or why he targeted me. I decided to take a week-long backpacking trip through Yosemite National Park. I had been feeling burned out from work, and I thought some time in nature would help me clear my mind. I planned my route carefully, packed everything I needed, and set off early on a Sunday morning. The first day was amazing. The air was fresh, the scenery was breathtaking, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. On the second night, I set up camp near a small stream. The spot was perfect, secluded and quiet. I cooked dinner, read for a while, and then went to bed. I slept soundly until just before dawn when I had to get up to relieve myself. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, but they definitely weren't mine. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone had passed by my camp while I was sleeping. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone. I tried to enjoy the hike, but the unease lingered. That night, I camped near a rocky outcrop, thinking it would be safer. I woke up several times during the night, listening for any sounds. The forest was eerily quiet. In the morning, I found more footprints, closer this time. Each night, the footprints got closer and closer to my tent. I never heard or saw anyone, but I knew someone was following me. By the fourth night, I was sleeping with a knife under my pillow. My nerves were on edge, and I started feeling paranoid. I began setting traps around my camp, hoping to catch whoever was stalking me, but they never worked. The footprints were always there in the morning, undisturbed by my traps. On the fifth night, I barely slept at all. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, but eventually, I had to let it die out. The darkness felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. When dawn finally broke, I found the footprints right next to my tent. Whoever it was had been standing just inches away from me while I slept. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the main trail. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and I was starting to fear for my safety. As I hiked back, I felt like I was being followed the whole time. I kept my knife in my hand, ready to defend myself if I had to. I moved quickly, not taking any breaks, driven by the need to get out of the wilderness and back to safety. On the sixth night, I camped as close to the main trail as I could. I thought maybe the increased traffic would deter whoever was following me. I built a large fire and stayed awake as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually took over. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps circling my camp. My heart was pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. In the morning, the footprints were back, and they were the closest yet. Panic set in. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and practically ran down the trail. I didn't care about the scenery anymore. All I wanted was to get out of there. As I got closer to the park entrance, I started to see other hikers again, and the feeling of being watched began to fade. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was exhausted and shaken. I threw my gear in the car and drove away without looking back. Me, my boyfriend Josh, and our two friends, Amanda and Eric. We all needed a break, and the Boundary Waters seemed perfect. Remote, beautiful, peaceful. We packed everything we needed and drove up early on a Friday morning, excited for a long weekend away from the city. The first day was perfect. We found a great spot to set up camp, right by the water. We spent the afternoon kayaking and swimming, and in the evening, we cooked over the campfire and told stories. It was exactly what we had hoped for. On the second day, things changed. We noticed another group had set up camp not too far from us. For men, a bit older than us, maybe in their late 30s or early 40s. At first, they seemed fine. They waved when we passed by on our kayaks, and we waved back. But as the day went on, their behavior started to change. It started with the noise. They were loud, playing music, shouting, and laughing late into the night. We tried to ignore it, but it was hard to sleep. In the morning, we found some of our stuff had been moved around. Nothing was missing, but it was unsettling. Josh thought maybe it was an animal, but I wasn't so sure. That afternoon, we decided to hike a bit and explore. When we got back, we found the men waiting for us at our camp. They were drunk and aggressive, accusing us of taking their fishing gear. We hadn't touched their stuff, and we told them so, but they wouldn't listen. They got in Josh's face, and things got tense. Eventually, they backed off, but we all felt uneasy. We decided it was best to move. We didn't want any trouble, and there were plenty of other spots we could set up camp. We packed up quickly and found a new location a couple of miles away. It was less ideal, but it felt safer. That night, we heard noises outside our tent. Footsteps, whispers. We looked out and saw shadows moving around. The men had followed us. They were messing with our stuff again, throwing things around, laughing. We stayed inside, hoping they would leave. Eventually, they did, but none of us slept much. In the morning, we found our food scattered and some of our gear damaged. It was clear they were trying to scare us. We decided to pack up and head back to the main trail. We figured it was better to cut the trip short than risk another encounter. As we were packing, they showed up again. This time, they were armed with sticks and rocks. They blocked our way and started taunting us, saying we were trespassing and needed to leave. We tried to reason with them, but it was no use. They wanted a fight. Josh and Eric tried to stand their ground, but it quickly turned violent. One of the men swung a stick at Josh, hitting him in the shoulder. Eric tackled another man, and it turned into a brawl. Amanda and I tried to help, but we were outnumbered. I grabbed our flare gun from the pack and fired it into the air. The loud bang and bright light startled everyone. The men backed off for a moment, and we used the chance to grab what we could and run. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail. We reported the incident to the park rangers, who promised to look into it. We were shaken, bruised, and exhausted, but we were safe. The trip that was supposed to be a peaceful escape had turned into a nightmare. We never found out what happened to the men. The rangers didn't find them or their camp. Maybe they moved on, or maybe they just disappeared into the wilderness. All I know is that I'll never forget the fear I felt that night. The feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone out there wanted to hurt us. I decided to go camping alone in the Black Hills to take photos. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from everyone. I found a perfect spot, set up my tent, and spent the day hiking and taking pictures. The scenery was breathtaking, and I felt at ease. By nightfall, I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. When I woke up the next morning, everything was gone. My tent, my supplies, even my camera gear. At first, I thought I must have set up camp somewhere else and sleepwalked away. But there was no sign of my camp. It was like it vanished. Panic set in. I tried to stay calm, but without my supplies, I was in trouble. I started walking, hoping to find my things or at least a familiar path. Hours passed, and I found nothing. My stomach growled, and my throat was dry. I had no idea which direction to go. As I stumbled deeper into the forest, I heard footsteps. A man emerged from the trees. He looked rugged, with a scruffy beard and worn clothes. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Looks like you're lost," he said. I nodded, too scared to speak. He seemed to sense my fear. "I saw your camp last night," he continued. "It was strange, the way everything disappeared. Come with me, I can help you." Relieved, I followed him. He led me to a small clearing with a makeshift shelter. Something about the place felt off, but I was desperate. He offered me water and food, and I accepted gratefully. As I ate, he watched me closely. "You know," he said, "things don't just vanish out here. Someone took your stuff." I shivered. "Who?" He leaned in, his expression darkening. "Maybe someone who doesn't want you here." My heart pounded. "Why are you helping me, then?" He shrugged. "Maybe I don't want you here either, but I'm giving you a chance." His words sent a chill down my spine. I needed to leave. I thanked him and said I should keep searching. He frowned but didn't stop me. As I walked away, I felt his eyes on my back. I moved quickly, my mind racing. Who was that man? What did he want? I couldn't trust him. I had to find my own way out. The forest seemed to close in around me, every rustle of leaves making me jump. I found a stream and followed it, hoping it would lead to civilization. As night fell, I heard footsteps again. I ducked behind a tree, peeking out. The man was following me, his expression predatory. I ran. Branches scratched my face, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, getting closer. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I tried to get up, but it was too late. He stood over me, his smile cold. "You should have stayed." I scrambled back, trying to get away. He grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "What do you want?" I cried. "To teach you a lesson," he hissed. "People like you don't belong here." I struggled, but he was too strong. Desperation gave me strength, and I kicked him hard in the shin. He let go, cursing. I took my chance and ran, my injured ankle screaming with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I burst out of the trees onto a dirt road. Headlights blinded me, and I waved frantically. A truck screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing my terror. "Help me," I gasped. "Someone's after me." He didn't hesitate. He helped me into the truck, and we sped off. I looked back, but the man was gone. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. The driver took me to a ranger station. I told them everything, and they promised to search for the man. They gave me food and water, and I finally felt safe. My son Ethan and I decided to take a bonding trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. It had been a while since we spent some real time together, away from the distractions of everyday life. We packed our gear, excited for the adventure ahead, and headed into the forest. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, enjoying the fresh air and stunning views. By evening, we set up camp by a small stream. After a simple meal, we sat by the campfire, sharing stories and laughing. It felt good to connect with Ethan like this. As night fell, we crawled into our tent and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside our tent. I thought it might be an animal, but the sounds were too deliberate. I quietly woke Ethan, and we both listened. There were definitely people outside, rummaging through our campsite. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. When I stepped out, the intruders were gone, but our supplies were scattered everywhere. Our food was missing, and our backpacks had been rifled through. Ethan and I spent the rest of the night on high alert, barely sleeping. At dawn, we tried to make sense of what happened. "Why would someone do this, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm for his sake. "But we need to be careful." We spent the day trying to find a spot with cell reception, but it was no use. The forest was dense, and we were too far from any civilization. As the day wore on, a sense of unease settled over us. We decided to stay another night, hoping the intruders wouldn't return. That evening, we built a bigger fire and stayed close to it, hoping the light would deter anyone from approaching. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to close in. Every rustle and snap of a twig made us jump. Around midnight, the noises started again. Footsteps, whispers, and the sound of branches breaking. I motioned for Ethan to stay quiet, and we listened intently. The sounds were getting closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Suddenly, I saw figures moving in the shadows. There were at least 3 men, their faces hidden by the darkness. They were watching us, waiting. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "Ethan, we need to leave." "Now," I whispered urgently. We grabbed our remaining gear and slowly backed away from the campfire, trying not to make any noise. The men didn't move, just stood there, staring. Once we were a safe distance away, we turned and ran. We stumbled through the forest, trying to put as much distance between us and the men as possible. The darkness was disorienting, and I struggled to find a clear path. Ethan stayed close, his breathing heavy with fear. After what felt like hours, we found a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. My mind was racing, trying to figure out our next move. We couldn't go back to our camp, and we were too far from the trailhead to make it back by morning. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We continued through the night, our nerves frayed and our bodies exhausted. Every noise made us jump, convinced the men were right behind us. As dawn approached, we found a large rock formation and decided to take shelter. We huddled together, trying to stay warm and hidden. The next day was a blur of fear and exhaustion. We moved as quietly as possible, constantly looking over our shoulders. I knew we needed to find help, but the dense forest seemed to stretch on forever. By late afternoon, we stumbled onto a trail. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. We heard voices up ahead and ducked into the bushes. The men from our campsite were walking down the trail, scanning the forest. They were looking for us. We waited until they passed and then continued in the opposite direction. My heart pounded with fear and adrenaline. We had to find help before they found us. As the sun began to set, we finally saw a ranger station in the distance. I felt a surge of hope and urged Ethan to keep going. We ran the last stretch, bursting into the station, breathless and terrified. The rangers listened to our story and immediately took action. They escorted us back to civilization and assured us they would search for the men. Ethan and I were safe, but the experience left a deep scar. I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Ozark National Forest. It was a perfect escape from my stressful job and the noise of the city. I set up my tent in a secluded spot, far from any trails, hoping for a few days of peace and quiet. On the second evening, I was sitting by the campfire, listening to the portable radio I'd brought along. It was mostly static, but suddenly a news report cut through. They were warning about a dangerous convict who had escaped from a nearby prison. My heart skipped a beat. They said he was armed and warned people to stay indoors and be cautious. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself I was far from any towns or roads. The forest was vast, and the chances of him finding me seemed slim. I doused the fire and went into my tent, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, and circling my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving closer. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the tent. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, every nerve on edge. The forest was too quiet, and I felt like I was being watched. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent cautiously. There were clear footprints in the dirt around my campsite. Someone had definitely been there, watching me. My stomach twisted with fear. I knew it had to be the escaped convict. There was no one else around for miles. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, deciding to leave immediately. The nearest ranger station was a few miles away, and I hoped I could reach it before anything happened. As I started down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed. The forest was dense, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I moved quickly, trying to put as much distance between me and the campsite as possible. The trail twisted and turned, and I began to feel disoriented. I knew I had to stay calm, but it was hard with the adrenaline pumping through my veins. After an hour of walking, I heard footsteps behind me again. I froze, listening. They were getting closer. I darted off the trail, hiding behind a thick tree trunk. The footsteps stopped, and I peeked around the tree. A man was standing on the trail, looking around. He was disheveled, with wild eyes. It was him, the convict. I stayed as still as I could, praying he wouldn't see me. He seemed to be searching for something, and I realized it was me. He started walking again, moving further down the trail. I waited until he was out of sight before I started moving again, this time off the trail, trying to stay hidden. My heart was pounding, and I knew I had to stay quiet. I moved through the underbrush, trying to be as silent as possible. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me wince. I had to find a way out of the forest without him finding me. The hours dragged on, and I felt like I was getting nowhere. The forest seemed endless, and I was beginning to lose hope. Then, I saw a glimpse of a building through the trees. It was the ranger station. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I approached the station cautiously, keeping an eye out for any sign of the convict. When I got closer, I saw a ranger's truck parked outside. I ran to the door and pounded on it, praying someone was inside. The door opened, and a ranger stood there, looking surprised. I told him everything, and he quickly ushered me inside. They radioed for backup, and soon other rangers arrived. They searched the area and found signs that the convict had been following me. They assured me I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the fear that had taken hold. The experience left me shaken. The forest, which had always been a place of peace and solitude for me, now felt threatening. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing someone dangerous was out there, hunting me. I went hiking on a less-traveled trail in Shenandoah National Park last month. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from work, a chance to recharge. I'd done plenty of hikes before, but this trail was supposed to be more rugged and isolated, which I thought would be perfect. The first day went smoothly. The weather was good, and the trail was scenic. I stopped often to take in the views and enjoy the solitude. But on the second day, I took a wrong turn. It wasn't obvious at first, but paths all seemed to blend together. I had a map and a compass, but I couldn't figure out where I went wrong. By the time dusk rolled in, I was completely turned around. I'd lost track of how many miles I'd walked and had no idea where I was. The sun was setting fast, and I started to feel a rising sense of panic. I needed to find a place to camp for the night, so I pushed on, hoping to find some sort of sign or landmark. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead with a few tents set up. I was relieved to see signs of other people. I walked into the clearing, hoping someone might be able to help. As I got closer, a man emerged from one of the tents. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing rugged outdoor gear. He greeted me with a friendly smile and offered me a seat by the fire he had going. I explained my situation, telling him I'd lost my way and needed help getting back to the main trail. He seemed genuinely sympathetic and offered to guide me back the next morning. I was hesitant but grateful. I decided to stay the night with him, thinking it would be better than wandering the woods alone in the dark. As night settled in, he made some small talk, asking about my hike and where I was from. I was a bit uneasy but chalked it up to nerves. He seemed nice enough, and it was comforting to have someone else around. But as the night went on, I noticed a few things that made me uncomfortable. He kept asking questions about my hiking gear, my plans, and my route. It felt a bit intrusive, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I shrugged it off and tried to relax by the fire. However, his questions became more specific, and I started to get the feeling he was probing for information. Around midnight, he went to his tent for a while. I was alone by the fire, and I started thinking about how I'd gotten there. It was strange how isolated this campsite was. I couldn't see any other signs of life, no trails or markers, just dense woods and darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he came back, he had a different demeanor. He was still friendly, but his eyes seemed more intense. He mentioned that it would be a tough hike back to the main trail and that we should rest up. I noticed that he didn't seem to be preparing for bed. Instead, he kept glancing around the clearing, almost like he was on high alert. I decided to try and get some sleep in my tent, though I didn't feel very comfortable. Every creak of the tent and crackle of the fire seemed louder than usual. I lay there wide awake, listening for any sounds. I heard movement outside, but it was too dark to see anything. Eventually, I got up to use the restroom. As I stepped outside, I saw the man standing near the edge of the clearing, talking softly to himself. It wasn't clear what he was saying, but it didn't sound right. I quickly went back to my tent, trying not to draw attention to myself. When I woke up the next morning, the man was already up and preparing breakfast. I didn't see any sign of the food I'd brought with me. It was strange, but I figured he must have had his own supplies. I packed up my things and tried to stay upbeat, though my nerves were frayed. We set out for what I hoped would be the main trail. The man led the way, and I followed, trying to keep up. As we walked, he made more casual conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The way he looked at me, the questions he asked, it all seemed to have an ulterior motive. At one point, he asked if I'd noticed anything strange about the area. I said no, but he seemed to insist that there were some odd things about the forest. He spoke in a way that made me uneasy, almost like he was hinting at something but not coming right out with it. I started to feel more and more paranoid. It was like I was being led somewhere, but I wasn't sure where. Every time we stopped for a break, I felt the need to watch my back. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to get lost out here, especially if they didn't know the area well. By late afternoon, I began to recognize some landmarks that matched my map. We were getting closer to the main trail, and I felt a wave of relief. But just as I started to relax, the man's behavior grew more erratic. He seemed impatient and frustrated, and his questions became more direct. When we finally reached the main trail, I thanked him and started to make my way back to the trailhead. I could see my car in the distance, and I felt an immense sense of relief. I turned to say goodbye, but he didn't respond. He just watched me with a strange look in his eyes. I hurried to my car, quickly loading my gear and getting out of there. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror but didn't see him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if I had stayed another night with him. The whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't understand why someone would act like that, especially in such a remote place. It made me realize how vulnerable I had been and how important it is to trust your instincts. We decided to go camping at Mount Hood National Forest for the weekend. It was me, Sarah, Jake, and Ryan. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, set up our tents, and got a fire going. The place was perfect, quiet, secluded, surrounded by tall trees. As the sun went down, we were sitting around the fire, laughing and talking about old times. Out of nowhere, a man appeared from the darkness. He looked rough, like he had been out in the woods for days. He told us he was lost and asked if he could join us for a bit. We all looked at each other, unsure, but Jake, being the friendly guy he is, invited him to sit down. The man introduced himself as Tom. We gave him some food and water, and he sat by the fire, warming his hands. At first, everything seemed fine. He was quiet, but we just figured he was tired. As the night went on, Tom's behavior started to change. He kept looking around, like he was checking if someone was watching him. He asked us strange questions about how long we were staying and if anyone knew we were there. It made me uneasy. Sarah whispered to me that she didn't trust him. I agreed, but I didn't know how to ask him to leave without causing a scene. Ryan suggested we make up a story about an early hike to hint that it was time to call it a night. When we told Tom about our early hike, he just stared at us for a long moment before smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I can stay up and keep the fire going," he said. His voice had an edge to it now, something unsettling. We pretended to go along with it, but once we got into our tents, we quietly talked about what to do. Jake suggested that one of us keep watch while the others slept, just in case. We agreed, and Jake took the first shift. I couldn't sleep. I kept listening for any sound from outside. After what felt like hours, I heard Jake whispering urgently. I peeked out and saw Tom standing over the fire, talking to himself, his movements jerky and strange. Ryan took over the watch, and I finally drifted off to a light sleep. I woke up to Ryan shaking me. "He's getting worse," he said. "We need to do something." We gathered outside the tents, trying to come up with a plan. Tom noticed us and walked over, his face twisted in anger. "What are you whispering about?" he demanded. Jake tried to calm him down, saying we were just discussing our plans for the next day. Tom didn't seem convinced. "I think you're trying to get rid of me," he said, stepping closer. Sarah suggested we give him more food and supplies and point him in the direction of the nearest trail. Tom laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think I'm stupid?" he asked. "I know what you're doing." He started pacing around the camp, muttering to himself. We were all on edge, trying to figure out how to defuse the situation. Ryan quietly told us he had a pocket knife, just in case. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. Tom suddenly stopped and looked at us. "I'm not leaving," he said. "You're the ones who need to go." Jake tried to reason with him, saying we were all just trying to enjoy the weekend and that he could stay if he calmed down. Tom didn't seem to hear him. He pulled out a small, rusty knife from his jacket and waved it around. Panic set in. We backed away, trying to keep calm. Ryan whispered that we needed to get to the car and leave. The problem was, the car was a good 10-minute walk from the campsite, and we didn't know if Tom would follow us. Jake decided to distract him while we gathered our things. He kept talking to Tom, trying to keep him occupied. The rest of us quickly and quietly packed up what we could carry. On the count of 3, Ryan whispered, "We make a run for it." I nodded, my heart pounding. 1, 2, 3. We bolted, running through the dark forest towards the car. I could hear Tom shouting behind us, but I didn't look back. We stumbled over roots and rocks, but we kept going, driven by fear. When we finally reached the car, we threw our stuff in and jumped inside. Ryan started the engine, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite and Tom behind. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles away. We were all shaken, trying to process what had just happened. Sarah called the police and told them everything. They said they would send someone to check the area. We spent the rest of the night in a motel, too scared to sleep. The next day, the police called and said they hadn't found Tom but would keep an eye out. They told us we did the right thing by leaving in to be more careful in the future. That weekend left a scar. We haven't been camping since, and I don't think we ever will. The thought of Tom out there somewhere still sends chills down my spine. I decided to go hiking alone one weekend to clear my head. I found a trail that was far from the usual busy spots. It was late afternoon when I started, and the forest was quiet and peaceful. I liked the solitude, the way the trees blocked out the noise of the world. I walked for a few hours, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birds. As the sun started to set, I noticed a man up ahead. He was limping and looked like he was in pain. He had a backpack, but it was torn, and his clothes were dirty. I approached him, asking if he was okay. He said he had fallen and twisted his ankle. He looked desperate, saying he had been out there for hours and couldn't walk properly. I offered to help him back to the main trail. He seemed grateful, and I felt good about helping someone in need. We walked slowly, his arm over my shoulder for support. He kept thanking me, saying he didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't come along. I told him it was no problem, just glad I could help. As we walked, I noticed he kept looking around, like he was checking for something. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. He was probably just nervous, being injured and all. We talked a bit, but his answers were short, and he seemed distracted. The forest was getting darker, and I suggested we hurry to find a spot to rest for the night. We reached a small clearing, and I set up a little camp. I had a flashlight and some basic supplies, so I gave him some water and a snack. He thanked me again, but there was something off about his tone. It was getting colder, and I suggested we build a small fire. He agreed, and I started gathering some wood. When I got back to the camp, he was rummaging through my backpack. I asked him what he was doing, and he jumped back, saying he was just looking for more water. I handed him a bottle and told him to sit down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't want to leave him there alone. As the fire grew, the flickering light cast strange shadows around us. He kept glancing into the darkness, making me more and more nervous. I asked him where he was from, and his answers were vague. It felt like he was hiding something. I decided to stay awake and keep an eye on him, just in case. Hours passed, and he eventually fell asleep. I sat by the fire, trying to stay alert. I kept thinking about his odd behavior and the way he had looked through my stuff. I wondered if he was really injured or if it was just a ploy. I couldn't let my guard down. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. Two men stepped into the clearing, both looking rough and dangerous. They saw me and the guy I had helped, and one of them smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. The man I had helped jumped up, his limp suddenly gone. He walked over to them, and they started talking in low voices. My heart was pounding as I realized I had walked into a trap. They turned to me, and one of them pulled out a knife. I backed away, holding up my hands. They told me to sit down and keep quiet. They started going through my things, taking anything valuable. My phone, wallet, even my watch. The guy I had helped just stood there, watching with a smirk on his face. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I had been so stupid to trust him. One of the men started to tie my hands with rope. I struggled, but the other one pressed the knife against my throat, telling me to stay still. They tied me up and pushed me to the ground. I could feel the cold earth against my face, and I knew I was in serious trouble. They started arguing about what to do next. I heard one of them say something about leaving me there, but the other one wanted to take me with them. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. They were distracted, and I realized this might be my only chance. I twisted my hands, feeling the rope loosen just a bit. I kept working at it, trying to stay calm. The men were still arguing, and I saw my chance. I broke free and ran into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran blindly through the forest, branches scratching my face and arms. I tripped and fell, but I got up and kept running. I could hear them getting closer, their voices angry and threatening. I knew I had to find a place to hide. I saw a large tree with thick roots and squeezed myself into a gap between them. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. They ran past, still shouting. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until their voices faded into the distance. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out and started moving again, more carefully this time. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I had to keep moving. I was exhausted and scared, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled upon a main trail. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My body was aching, and I was so tired, but I pushed on. The sky was starting to lighten, and I knew I had to be close to the trailhead. Eventually, I saw a parking lot and nearly cried with relief. I found my car and drove to the nearest town, shaking and covered in dirt. I went straight to the police and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I couldn't shake the fear that those men were still out there. The experience left me shaken and wary. I used to love hiking alone, but now I can't do it without feeling a surge of panic. I had planned the camping trip for weeks. Work had been exhausting, and I needed a break. Being out in nature always helped me clear my head. I chose a remote spot in the forest, away from the usual campsites, to really disconnect. I arrived late afternoon, set up my tent, and got a fire going. It was peaceful, just the sounds of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. As the sun started to set, I took a walk around my campsite. I noticed some footprints nearby. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too big. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a hiker passing through earlier. I went back to my fire, made some dinner, and tried to relax. But the footprints kept nagging at me. I decided to go to bed early. As I was getting into my tent, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved quickly between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I stared into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I convinced myself it was just an animal and crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. My heart was pounding as I listened carefully. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, shining the light outside. There was no one there. I stepped out, looking around the campsite. Everything seemed normal, except for a few items that had been moved. My water bottle was on the other side of the fire pit, and my backpack was unzipped. Panic started to set in. Someone had been here, watching me. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the fire, keeping it going until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my things. I didn't want to be there any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I was packing up, I found more footprints around my tent. They were fresh. Someone had definitely been here during the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly finished packing and started the hike back to my car. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt oppressive and menacing. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to stay calm and keep moving, but my mind was racing. Who had been watching me? And why? When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. As I drove, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. I drove straight home and locked myself in. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked all the locks on my doors and windows, pulled the curtains closed, and tried to calm down. But every little noise made me jump. I knew I should call the police, but what could I tell them? That I felt like I was being watched in the woods? Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I stayed inside as much as possible, avoiding going out alone. I felt paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. It sounded crazy, even to me. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my window. My heart started racing. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure standing in my yard, watching my house. I froze, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police? Confront them? I decided to call the police. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. I told them someone was outside my house, watching me. They said they would send someone over. I hung up and kept watching the figure outside. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they did, the figure was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. They told me to call if anything else happened and left. I felt a little safer, but the fear didn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching, waiting. But the figure didn't return. The next day, I installed security cameras around my house. I couldn't live like this, constantly in fear. The cameras helped a little, but I still felt on edge. A week passed without any incidents. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was over. But then I found a note in my mailbox. It was simple, just a piece of paper with the words "I'm watching you" written on it. My heart sank. It wasn't over. I called the police again, showed them the note. They said they would increase patrols in my area, but there wasn't much else they could do. I felt helpless, constantly on edge. I started carrying a knife with me, just in case. Another week passed, and then another. No more notes, no more sightings. I started to think maybe it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed inside as much as possible, avoiding going out alone. My life had changed, and I didn't know if it would ever go back to normal. Months passed, and slowly, the fear started to fade. I still felt uneasy, but I started going out more, trying to reclaim my life. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and empty. I was on a solo road trip, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road. It was supposed to be freeing. But somewhere along the highway, everything changed. It started in the afternoon. I noticed a truck in my rearview mirror, an old, beat-up pickup. It was nothing unusual at first. Just another vehicle on the road. But after a few hours, I realized it was always there, keeping the same distance. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were heading the same direction. But as the hours passed, the unease grew. Every time I looked back, there it was. I decided to pull over at a rest stop, hoping to let the truck pass. I parked and waited. 10 minutes went by. Then 20. No sign of the truck. I started to relax, thinking it had finally gone its own way. But as soon as I got back on the highway, there it was again, closer than before. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't normal. Someone was following me. I tried to keep my cool. I kept driving, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The truck stayed with me, never overtaking, just following. I decided to confront the driver. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, or maybe I could scare them off. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the road. The truck slowed down but then vanished, as if it had never been there. I got out of the car, looking around. The highway was deserted, just me and the empty road. I stood there for a while, feeling foolish and anxious. After a few minutes, I got back into my car and started driving again. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then I saw it in the mirror, closer than ever. The truck's headlights glaring at me, almost blinding in the twilight. Fear gripped me. This was no coincidence. I pressed down on the gas, speeding up, trying to put distance between us. But the truck matched my speed, staying right behind me. I drove for miles, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of civilization. Night fell, and the darkness made everything worse. The truck's headlights were the only light in the rearview mirror, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service out here. I was on my own. Desperation set in. I needed to lose the truck. I took the next exit, hoping to find a town or at least another road. The exit led to a narrow, winding road through a forest. The truck followed, always keeping the same distance. I sped through the curves, the trees a blur on either side. The road twisted and turned, and I hoped the truck would lose control. But it stayed with me, never faltering. My heart raced, fear turning to panic. Suddenly, the road opened up into a clearing. I saw a small, rundown gas station, its lights flickering. I pulled in, skidding to a stop. I jumped out of the car, looking around. The truck was gone. The gas station was deserted. I banged on the door, shouting for help. No one answered. The place looked abandoned, a relic from another time. I felt trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. I got back into my car, ready to keep driving. But as soon as I started the engine, the truck appeared again, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was closer than ever, right on my bumper. I could see the outline of the driver, a dark figure behind the wheel. I sped off, back onto the winding road. The truck followed, relentless. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to think of a way out. The road seemed endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, led somewhere against my will. Finally, I saw a sign for a town up ahead. Hope flared in my chest. I took the turn, speeding towards the lights in the distance. The truck stayed with me, but I could see the town now, safety just ahead. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, this one lit and bustling with people. I jumped out of the car, running inside. I told the clerk about the truck, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He looked outside but saw nothing. The truck had vanished again. The clerk called the police, and they arrived quickly. They took my statement, but there was no sign of the truck. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I stayed in that town overnight, too scared to get back on the road. The next morning, I continued my trip, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I saw a truck, my heart would skip a beat. When I first met Jack, he seemed perfect. He had just moved into the apartment across the hall, and his charming smile and friendly demeanor instantly drew me in. We bumped into each other in the hallway one morning, and he introduced himself with a warm handshake. "I'm Jack," he said. "Just moved in. Nice to meet you." Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other. In the elevator, at the mailboxes, even at the local coffee shop. It felt like fate. Jack was everything I had been looking for in a partner. He was attentive, kind, and always knew how to make me laugh. We started dating, and it felt like a dream come true. Our first few dates were magical. He took me to nice restaurants, planned romantic picnics, and always seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. My friends were thrilled for me. "He sounds amazing," they would say. And he was. At least, at first. As we spent more time together, little things started to nag at me. He was secretive about his past, always deflecting when I asked about his previous jobs or relationships. One night, curiosity got the better of me. While he was in the shower, I snooped through his things. I found a box hidden in the back of his closet, filled with old photos and documents. The photos showed a different side of Jack. In some, he looked angry, almost violent. There were court documents too, mentioning restraining orders and charges of harassment. My heart pounded as I put everything back. Who was this man I had let into my life? I decided to confront him, but I needed to be careful. The next evening, I casually asked him about his past relationships. He grew tense, his eyes darkening. "They didn't end well," he said, his tone sharp. I knew I had to end things, but I was afraid. Jack had a dark side, and I didn't know how he would react. I decided to break up with him in a public place to stay safe. We met at a busy cafe, and I nervously told him that I needed to end things. His charming facade slipped, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "You can't just leave me, Mary," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're meant to be together." I tried to stay calm, standing my ground. "It's over," "Jack, please respect that." He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those piercing eyes. Over the next few days, I noticed him everywhere. Outside my apartment, at the grocery store, even at my workplace. It felt like he was always watching me. I told my friends about my suspicions, and they urged me to go to the police. But without concrete evidence, I knew it would be hard to get a restraining order. One night, I heard strange noises outside my door. My heart raced as I peeked through the peephole. Jack was there, just standing and staring at my door. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do without catching him in the act. My anxiety grew with each passing day. I installed extra locks and even started carrying pepper spray, but I still felt vulnerable. One evening, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I cautiously entered, calling out, but there was no answer. Everything seemed in place, but I felt a chill run down my spine. As I moved through the apartment, I found a note on my bed. "You can't hide from me, Mary," it read. My hands trembled as I called the police again. The officers arrived and searched the apartment, but there was no sign of Jack. They advised me to stay with a friend, but I was determined not to let him drive me out of my own home. I decided to install cameras inside and outside my apartment. I needed evidence if I was going to get the police to take this seriously. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle sounded like a threat. I watched the camera feeds obsessively, my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I saw him on the camera by my front door. He was picking the lock, his movements slow and deliberate. I called the police, my voice shaking. This time, the police arrived quickly and caught him in the act. Jack was arrested, but the fear didn't go away. I knew how manipulative he could be. I pressed charges and got a restraining order. The court proceedings were terrifying, but I had to stand up for myself. Jack's true nature was revealed in court, and he was sentenced to prison. Even with Jack behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved to a new apartment and changed my phone number, trying to start fresh. My friends supported me through the ordeal, but the trauma lingered. I sought therapy to help deal with the lingering fear and paranoia. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I made new friends, found new hobbies, and started to feel like myself again. But the memory of Jack's obsession haunted me. I became more cautious, always aware of my surroundings. Trust was hard to come by, but I learned to listen to my instincts. Years passed, and the fear lessened, but it never fully disappeared. I would occasionally check online to make sure Jack was still in prison. One day, I received a letter. My heart stopped when I saw the sender's name, Jack. Inside was a single sentence, "I'll see you soon." Panic surged through me, but I refused to let it control my life. I reported the letter to the police and took extra precautions. I wouldn't let Jack's shadow dominate my life. I had escaped him once, and I would do it again. The evening air was thick with humidity as I pulled up to the old, isolated house at the edge of town. It was a late showing, unusual but not unheard of in my line of work. The client insisted on seeing the property after sunset due to his busy schedule. I glanced at my watch, 8:45 p.m. The sky was already a deep indigo, stars beginning to dot the horizon. I parked my car and grabbed my flashlight, noting the dilapidated state of the house. It was a fixer-upper, no doubt, but with potential. My client, Mr. Jameson, arrived shortly after. We exchanged pleasantries and made our way to the front door. The creaking hinges and peeling paint added to the house's eerie ambience. Inside, the house was dark, the air stale and heavy. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Must be the wiring, I muttered, pulling out my flashlight. No worries, Mr. Jameson said with a tight smile. I brought my own flashlight too. He clicked it on, casting a narrow beam of light across the dusty living room. We started the tour, moving from room to room. The house was bigger than it seemed from the outside, with a maze of hallways and small, interconnected rooms. As we descended into the basement, the air grew colder. This could be a great space for a wine cellar, I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Mr. Jameson seemed uninterested, his attention focused elsewhere. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. We finished the tour, and I locked up the house. Thank you for your time, Mr. Jameson said, his tone curt. He hurried to his car and drove off, leaving me alone. I sighed, feeling a bit uneasy. The house had an unsettling vibe, and I was eager to leave. I got into my car and started the engine, but it sputtered and died. Not now, I groaned, turning the key again. Nothing. I grabbed my phone to call for a tow, but there was no signal. Of course. With no other option, I decided to walk to the nearest gas station. It wasn't far, just a mile or so down the road. I grabbed my flashlight and set off. The road was dark and deserted, lined with tall trees that cast long shadows in the moonlight. I walked briskly, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves. Halfway there, I noticed a group of teenagers standing under a streetlight. They were talking in low voices, their laughter echoing eerily through the night. I tried to walk past them unnoticed, but one of them called out, "Hey, mister. You lost?" The tone was friendly, but something about it made my skin crawl. Just heading to the gas station, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Car trouble. That's a shame, another teenager said, stepping forward. He had a sinister grin on his face. This isn't the safest place at night. I forced a smile, hoping to diffuse any tension. I'll be fine. Thanks for the concern. They exchanged glances, a silent communication that made my heart race. Why don't we help you? The first teenager suggested. It's dangerous to be alone out here. I appreciate it, but I can manage, I said, taking a step back. Their presence felt suffocating, the night growing colder around us. We insist, the leader said, his grin widening. The others moved closer, forming a loose circle around me. Panic set in. Really, it's okay, I stammered, turning to leave. But one of them grabbed my arm, his grip tight and unyielding. You're not going anywhere, he hissed, his friendly facade dropping. The others laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. I yanked my arm free, backing away. What do you want? I demanded, my voice shaking. Just a bit of fun, the leader said, pulling out a knife. The blade glinted in the moonlight, and my heart pounded in my chest. Leave me alone, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I'll call the police. No signal out here, one of them sneered. You're on your own, old man. Desperation kicked in, and I turned and ran. Their laughter followed me, along with the sound of their footsteps. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted down the road. I could hear them gaining on me, their taunts growing louder. I stumbled into a clearing, my flashlight beam wavering. Ahead, I saw an old, abandoned barn. I made a beeline for it, hoping to find shelter. Inside, the barn was dark and musty, filled with old farming equipment. I hid behind a stack of hay bales, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The teenagers entered, their flashlights sweeping the barn. Come out, wherever you are, one of them sing-songed, his voice echoing off the walls. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. They were getting closer, their footsteps echoing ominously. Just when I thought they would find me, a siren wailed in the distance. The teenagers froze, then cursed under their breath. "Let's get out of here," the leader said. They retreated, their flashlights disappearing into the night. I stayed hidden for a while, waiting until I was sure they were gone. When I finally emerged, the night was silent again. I made my way back to the road, my mind racing. I would never forget their faces and the terror I felt that night. The rain started pouring down in sheets, hammering against my windshield. I squinted through the wipers, which were struggling to keep up. I was on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional cluster of trees. It was getting dark, and I needed to find shelter fast. Suddenly, my car skidded on a slick patch of road. I lost control, and the car veered off the road into a ditch. I hit the brakes, but it was too late. The car came to a jarring stop, and I sat there for a moment, stunned and shaken. The engine sputtered and died. I tried starting the car again, but it was no use. The storm was raging, and I knew I couldn't stay in the car all night. I grabbed my coat and flashlight from the back seat and stepped out into the downpour. My phone had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. I looked around and saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a house. I decided to make my way there, hoping to find help or at least some shelter from the storm. The mud sucked at my shoes as I trudged through the field, but I kept moving, driven by the need to get out of the rain. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old farmhouse. It looked abandoned, but the light I had seen was coming from inside. I reached the front porch and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, and the door creaked open. I stepped inside, calling out to see if anyone was there. The house was dark except for a single dim light in the hallway. The air smelled musty, like it had been closed up for a long time. I called out again, louder this time, but still, no one answered. I walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The light was coming from a room at the end of the hall. As I got closer, I could hear faint voices. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Something felt off, but I needed to get out of the storm. I pushed the door open and stepped into a small room. There was a fireplace with a weak fire burning in it, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A man and a woman were sitting at a table, staring at me with wide eyes. They looked disheveled and tense. "I'm sorry to intrude," I said, "but my car broke down, and I need help. Can I use your phone?" The man stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "We don't have a phone," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. The woman remained silent, her eyes darting between me and the man. "Please, I just need to wait out the storm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man nodded slowly. "You can stay," he said, "but you should leave as soon as the storm passes." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I didn't have much choice. He showed me to a small room with a bed and a window. The window was boarded up, letting in only a sliver of light. I sat on the bed, my clothes still damp, and tried to calm my racing heart. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak and the sound of the rain. I lay down, trying to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the strange way the man had looked at me. I decided to get up and look around, hoping to find something that could help me understand what was going on. I crept back down the hallway, careful not to make any noise. The house felt like a maze, with doors leading to more doors. I opened one and found a small room filled with old, dusty furniture covered in sheets. I moved on to the next door. I found a staircase leading to the basement. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, I found another door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The room was dark, but my flashlight revealed old tools and broken furniture. In the corner, I saw a figure huddled on the floor. I moved closer and realized it was a young girl, her hands tied and her mouth gagged. My heart pounded as I knelt beside her. "It's okay. I'm here to help," I whispered, trying to untie her. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and shook her head frantically. I worked faster, finally freeing her hands and removing the gag. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "They'll be back soon." I helped her to her feet, and we started back up the stairs as quietly as we could. When we reached the top, we heard voices coming from the hallway. The man and the woman were looking for me. "We need to hide," the girl said, pulling me towards a closet. We squeezed inside, closing the door just as the footsteps grew louder. I held my breath, listening as the man and woman walked past, their voices low and angry. "We need to find her," the man said. "She could ruin everything." The woman agreed, and their voices faded as they moved further down the hallway. We waited a few more minutes before slipping out of the closet and heading for the front door. We made it outside, but the rain was still coming down hard. I looked around, trying to figure out which way to go. "There's a barn out back," the girl said. "We can hide there until the storm passes." I nodded, and we ran towards the barn, the mud sucking at our feet. Inside the barn, we found a corner to hide in. I wrapped my coat around the girl, trying to keep her warm. "Who are they?" I asked. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. "They kidnapped me weeks ago. I don't know why. They said they were waiting for something." We sat in silence, listening to the storm and hoping the couple wouldn't find us. Hours passed, and the rain finally started to let up. I knew we couldn't stay hidden forever. We needed to find a way to escape and get help. "I think we should make a run for it," I said. The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. We crept out of the barn and headed towards the road. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man and woman coming after us. We reached the road and started walking, hoping to find someone who could help us. After what felt like hours, we saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, and the car slowed down. The driver rolled down the window, looking at us with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "We need help," I said. "There are people back there who are dangerous. They've been holding this girl captive." The driver nodded and told us to get in. He drove us to the nearest town, where we called the police. The police went to the farmhouse and arrested the man and woman. They found evidence of other kidnappings, and it turned out the couple had been running a human trafficking operation. The girl was reunited with her family, and I was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful to have escaped and helped the girl. I took the job as a security guard at the warehouse to help pay the bills. It was a quiet place, and the night shifts were usually uneventful. The warehouse was huge, filled with crates and pallets stacked high, with narrow aisles in between. I spent my shifts walking the perimeter, checking the doors, and making sure everything was secure. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a noise coming from the back of the warehouse. It was a faint clinking sound, like metal against metal. I stopped and listened, my heart starting to pound. The noise continued, and I knew something was wrong. I moved towards the back, staying close to the walls and trying to be as quiet as possible. As I got closer, the noises became louder, more distinct. I peered around a corner and saw a group of men prying open one of the large loading doors. They were dressed in dark clothes, with masks covering their faces. My first instinct was to confront them, but I knew I was outnumbered. I needed to call for help. I pulled out my phone, but as I did, I accidentally knocked over a metal rod that clattered loudly to the floor. The thieves turned towards the sound, and I ducked back behind the crates, my heart racing. I could hear their footsteps approaching, and I knew I had to move. I crept along the aisles, trying to stay out of sight. I reached the small office at the front of the warehouse and locked the door behind me. I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. As I waited for the police, I heard the thieves outside the office. They were trying to break down the door. I looked around for something to defend myself with, but there was nothing but a desk and some old office supplies. The door began to splinter, and I knew I didn't have much time. I spotted an air vent high up on the wall and quickly moved the desk underneath it. I climbed up and removed the vent cover, squeezing myself into the narrow duct just as the door gave way. I crawled through the vent, trying to stay quiet. The duct led me to another part of the warehouse, and I carefully pushed open the vent cover and climbed out. I was in the far corner of the building, far from the thieves but still trapped inside. I needed to find another way out. I moved through the aisles, keeping low and listening for any signs of the thieves. I could hear them moving around, shouting to each other. They knew I was still inside, and they were looking for me. I reached the loading dock and saw a small door that led outside. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I needed a key, and I remembered that the keys were kept in the office. I had to go back. I retraced my steps, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. When I reached the office, I could see the thieves were no longer inside. I slipped in and grabbed the keys from the desk drawer. Just as I turned to leave, one of the thieves spotted me. He shouted, and I bolted for the door. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps echoing through the warehouse. I reached the loading dock and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I found the right key and unlocked the door, throwing it open and running outside. The cold night air hit me, and I sprinted towards the perimeter fence. I could hear the thieves behind me, getting closer. I reached the fence and started to climb, but one of the thieves grabbed my leg and pulled me down. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. They surrounded me, and I knew I was in serious trouble. But then I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. The thieves heard them too, and they hesitated. I took advantage of the moment and scrambled to my feet, running towards the front gate. The police arrived just as I reached the gate, and the thieves scattered, disappearing into the night. The officers took me to safety, and I explained everything that had happened. The police searched the warehouse and found evidence of the attempted robbery, but the thieves were long gone. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area and keep an eye out for the suspects. I quit the security job the next day. The experience had shaken me to my core, and I couldn't face another night in that warehouse. I realized how close I had come to serious harm, and I knew I was lucky to have escaped. In the weeks that followed, I had trouble sleeping, haunted by the memories of that night. But with time, the fear began to fade. I found a new job in a safer environment, and I moved on with my life. The warehouse was eventually shut down, the company unable to recover from the attempted robbery. I was driving home late one night, passing through a remote stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The sky was pitch black, no moon, and the road was empty. I was used to this drive, but it always made me a bit uneasy. I turned up the radio to keep myself company, the only sound besides the hum of my engine. About an hour into my drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another car on the road. But after a while, I realized the car was still behind me, maintaining the same distance. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were headed the same way. After another 10 minutes, I started to get this weird feeling. The car wasn't passing me, and there weren't any other cars around. I decided to test it. I sped up a bit. The car sped up too. I slowed down, and they slowed down. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal. I tried to shake them off. I took an unexpected turn down a side road. The car followed. I turned again, trying to lose them in a maze of back roads. But no matter what I did, they stuck to me like glue. I could see the outline of the car now, dark and menacing, its headlights glaring like eyes. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. I was truly alone out here, no way to call for help. I kept driving, my mind racing. I had to think of something. I remembered a small rest stop a few miles ahead. It wasn't much, just a bathroom and some vending machines, but it was lit and had cameras. Maybe if I got there, they'd back off. I sped towards the rest stop, praying they wouldn't do anything crazy before I got there. As I approached, I could see the lights in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The car behind me suddenly sped up, swerving aggressively. They were trying to run me off the road. I gripped the wheel, trying to keep control. The car rammed into my bumper, and I nearly lost it. My car swerved, but I managed to stay on the road. I could see the rest stop now, just a little further. I pushed my car to its limit, the engine roaring as I raced towards the lights. I pulled into the rest stop, my tires screeching. The car followed, but they stopped at the entrance, just watching. I jumped out of my car and ran towards the building, hoping anyone, would be there. But it was empty. Just me and the cameras. I glanced back. The car was still there, idling. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified they'd come after me, but they just stayed in their car, headlights blinding me. I decided to stay in the lit area, hoping the cameras would deter them. Minutes felt like hours. I kept looking around, expecting them to make a move. But they didn't. Eventually, another car pulled into the rest stop. A family, by the looks of it. The car at the entrance revved its engine and sped off into the night. I collapsed against the wall, shaking with relief. The family looked at me, concerned. I told them what happened, and they offered to drive with me until I got to a safer area. I gratefully accepted. I followed them back onto the highway, glancing in my rearview mirror the whole time. But the car didn't come back. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop shaking. I locked all my doors and windows, double-checking everything. It was hours before I could sleep, and even then, I kept waking up, hearing the roar of that engine in my dreams. The next day, I reported the incident to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. No plates, no real description. Just a vague warning to be careful. It didn't make me feel any better. I still drive that road sometimes, but I'm always on edge, constantly checking my mirrors. I'll never forget that night, and I'll always wonder who was in that car and what they wanted. I was volunteering at a disaster relief site after a massive flood had hit our town. People lost their homes, and some lost everything. It felt good to help, to hand out supplies, and to see the relief on people's faces when they got something they needed. I was working long hours, but it was worth it. One evening, I was organizing donations in the back of the warehouse. It was getting late, and most of the other volunteers had gone home. I was about to leave when I heard voices coming from the office. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in their tone made me stop and listen. "We can't keep hiding this," one voice said. It was tense, almost frantic. "Relax," another voice replied. "No one will find out. We have everything under control." I recognized the second voice. It was the head of the relief organization, Mr. Dawson. He was well respected in the community, known for his charity work. Hearing him sound so cold sent a shiver down my spine. I waited until the voices stopped and the office door opened. I quickly hid behind a stack of boxes and watched as Mr. Dawson and another man I didn't recognize walked out. They were carrying a small, heavy-looking box. Once they left, I crept into the office. My heart was pounding, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found documents spread out on the desk. I saw spreadsheets, invoices, and bank statements. Something caught my eye, a list of donations that didn't match the supplies we had been giving out. It looked like a significant amount of money and goods were missing. I took a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking. As I was about to leave, I heard footsteps. I barely had time to eye behind the door when it opened, and Mr. Dawson walked back in. He was talking on his phone. "Yes, we moved the funds. No one suspects a thing," he said. "We'll make another transfer tomorrow." I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, he left again. I slipped out of the office and ran to my car. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore what I had found, but I was scared of what might happen if they found out I knew. The next day, I decided to confront one of the other volunteers I trusted, Sarah. She had been there as long as I had and seemed like someone who would know what to do. I showed her the photos, and her face went pale. "This is bad," she whispered. "We need to go to the police." We agreed to meet at the police station after our shifts. That day at the relief site felt like it dragged on forever. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to figure out what I had done. Mr. Dawson was there, acting normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was up. Finally, my shift ended, and I met Sarah outside. We drove to the police station together. We told the officer on duty everything, showed him the photos, and handed over the documents. He took it seriously and assured us they would investigate. I thought that would be the end of it, but things took a darker turn. The next day, I noticed a black car following me. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then I saw the same car outside my house that night. I called Sarah to warn her, but she didn't answer. Panic started to set in. I decided to stay with a friend for a few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "You're in over your head," a voice said. It was Mr. Dawson. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." I hung up, my hands trembling. I called the police again and told them about the threat. They promised to send someone to check on me, but I didn't feel safe. The following day, I heard that Sarah had gone missing. Her family was frantic, and the police were involved. I knew it was connected to what we had found. I felt guilty, terrified, and helpless. Desperate, I went back to the relief site to look for more evidence. I needed something concrete to bring these people down. As I was searching through the office again, I heard footsteps. This time, I couldn't hide in time. Mr. Dawson and the other man from before caught me. They grabbed me, and I tried to fight, but they were too strong. They dragged me into a back room and tied me to a chair. Mr. Dawson leaned in close, his face twisted with anger. "You should have stayed out of it," he hissed. "Now you're going to disappear, just like your friend." I was terrified, but I couldn't give up. I remembered the silent alarm button I had seen near the entrance earlier. If I could just get free and reach it, maybe I had a chance. They left me alone for a moment, probably to figure out what to do with me. I struggled against the ropes, and finally, I managed to loosen them enough to slip one hand free. I quietly worked on the other hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard them coming back, and I knew I had only seconds. I freed my other hand and ran for the door. They saw me and shouted, but I didn't look back. I sprinted to the front of the building and slammed my hand on the silent alarm button. The alarm rang out, louder than I expected. Panic set in as I heard them closing in. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby table and swung it at the first man who reached me. He went down, and I kept running. Sirens wailed in the distance, and I felt a glimmer of hope. The police arrived just as Mr. Dawson lunged at me. They pulled him off and handcuffed him, along with his accomplice. I collapsed on the ground, shaking and exhausted. The police took my statement and reassured me that I was safe now. They found Sarah alive, though shaken, and arrested several others involved in the corruption. It took me a long time to recover from that night. The relief site was shut down, and the community was outraged when the truth came out. I never volunteered there again, but I learned to trust my instincts and stay vigilant. I still think about that night sometimes, about how close I came to disappearing. I had always loved the 4th of July parade in our small town. It was the one time of year when everyone came together to celebrate, and there was something comforting about the familiar faces and cheerful atmosphere. This year was no different, and I was looking forward to the fireworks and festivities. The parade started in the early evening, with floats and marching bands making their way down Main Street. I had found a good spot near the front of the crowd, where I could see everything. Kids ran around with sparklers, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. It was perfect. As I watched the parade, I noticed a man standing a few feet away from me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just another person enjoying the parade. But something about him seemed off. He was staring at me, not in a friendly way, but with a cold, intense look. It made me uncomfortable, so I moved further into the crowd, trying to lose him. For a while, I managed to enjoy the parade without thinking about the man. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was still watching me, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a crowded event, after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. After the parade ended, the crowd began to disperse. I decided to head to the food stalls set up in the park. I figured it would be safer to be around people. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Sure enough, the man was still there, keeping his distance but never letting me out of his sight. I tried to blend in with the crowd, moving from one stall to another, but he was always a few steps behind. My heart raced, and my mind scrambled for a plan. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I knew I needed to get away from him. I spotted an alleyway between two buildings that led to a parking lot behind the park. It was a risk, but I hoped I could lose him there. I slipped into the alley, quickening my pace. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, and I prayed he wouldn't follow me. Halfway through the alley, I glanced back and saw him enter. Panic surged through me. I started to run, but the alley was narrow, and I could hear his footsteps getting closer. My breath came in short gasps, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The alley opened up into the parking lot, but it was empty. I scanned the area for help, but there was no one around. I had to think fast. I ducked behind a dumpster, hoping he would pass by without seeing me. I crouched there, trying to control my breathing, listening for his footsteps. They slowed as he reached the end of the alley. I held my breath, my body tense with fear. He stopped, and I could hear him breathing heavily. He was close, too close. I shut my eyes tight, wishing I could disappear. Then, I heard him speak. "I know you're here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can't hide from me." My blood ran cold. He was right there, just a few feet away. I had no idea what he wanted, but I knew I couldn't let him find me. I waited, hoping he would move on, but he didn't. The silence stretched on, and I felt like I was going to burst from the tension. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of running footsteps. My heart leaped into my throat. It took me a moment to realize that the noise had come from the street the fireworks show was starting. The sound must have startled him, because I heard him mutter something under his breath and walk away. I stayed hidden for a few more minutes, just to be sure he was gone. When I finally dared to peek out, the alley was empty. I ran to my car as fast as I could, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. The fireworks continued to explode in the sky, but I couldn't enjoy them. I drove home, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got inside, I locked all the doors and windows and called a friend to come over. I didn't want to be alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, and I kept thinking about the man's face, the way he had looked at me. I didn't know why he had followed me, and I didn't want to find out. The next day, I reported the incident to the police, but without much to go on, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to keep an eye out, but I knew it was unlikely they would find him. I haven't been to the 4th of July parade since then. The memory of that night is still too fresh, too terrifying. I try not to think about what could have happened if he had caught me. I'm just grateful I got away. I decided to go camping alone in the dense forests of Tennessee, seeking some solitude away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to reconnect with nature and clear my mind. I found a secluded spot near a small creek, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of wildlife. The first day passed without incident. I set up my tent, arranged my gear, and built a small campfire to cook dinner. The evening was serene, with the crackling fire and the stars twinkling overhead. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. But as the night crept in, things started to feel off. I noticed subtle changes around my campsite. Small items moved, my gear seemed slightly rearranged. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But then I found something that sent a chill down my spine, a piece of paper with a crude drawing of a skull and crossbones, left near my tent. I scanned the area, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Fear began to gnaw at me as I realized someone had been in my campsite while I was away. I decided to stay awake that night, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig or distant rustle made my heart race. I kept my flashlight close, casting nervous glances into the darkness beyond the edge of my campsite. I knew I had to be prepared in case whoever was out there decided to come back. The hours dragged on, and fatigue started to creep in despite my efforts to stay vigilant. Just as I was beginning to think I might have overreacted, I heard footsteps approaching. Quiet, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The footsteps paused near the edge of the clearing, then resumed, moving closer to my tent. Panic gripped me as I realized someone was standing just outside, observing me in the darkness. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. A shadow moved across the fabric of my tent, and I could sense someone lingering just beyond the thin barrier. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, but hesitated. What if they heard me? Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, low and menacing. "I know you're in there," it whispered, sending a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't be here." I remained frozen, unsure of what to do. The voice was unfamiliar, filled with hostility and malice. I strained to see through the fabric of the tent, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. The person outside seemed to grow impatient. "Come out," they demanded, their voice growing louder. I said, "Come out." I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. Standing before me was a figure cloaked in darkness, their features obscured. They held something in their hand, a knife, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Fear gripped me like a vice as I realized the danger I was in. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with adrenaline-fueled thoughts of escape. Without a second thought, I bolted into the forest, branches scraping against my arms and legs as I ran blindly through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard the person giving chase. Their footsteps pounded on the forest floor, closing the distance between us. I pushed myself harder, desperate to put more distance between myself and my pursuer. Fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, but I knew I had to keep going. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely at the mercy of the forest. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind me, growing closer with each passing moment. I spotted a narrow trail ahead and veered onto it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My legs burned with exertion, and my lungs ached from the effort of running. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of the figure still following me. They were relentless, their determination palpable even from a distance. I pushed myself harder, driven by sheer terror and the instinct to survive. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts in their wake. I could feel the person gaining on me, their presence a looming threat in the darkness. Just as I felt myself reaching the limits of my endurance, I burst into a small clearing. Ahead of me, I saw the faint glow of lights, a road. Relief flooded through me as I realized I had stumbled upon a hiking trail. Without hesitation, I sprinted toward it, my legs propelling me forward with renewed energy. I burst out onto the road, panting and covered in sweat and dirt. A car approached from the distance, its headlights cutting through the night. I waved frantically, hoping they would see me and stop. The driver slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just a few feet away. I stumbled toward the car, babbling incoherently about someone chasing me in the woods. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, helped me into the passenger seat and quickly drove away from the forest. He called the police as he drove, relaying my frantic account of what had happened. I struggled to catch my breath, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The man assured me everything would be okay, but I couldn't shake the fear that the person from the forest would find me again. The police met us at a nearby ranger station. They took my statement, and I described the person who had chased me as best as I could. They assured me they would search the area thoroughly, but I knew the chances of finding the individual in the vast wilderness were slim. They drove me to a nearby town where I could rest and recover from the ordeal. I stayed in a motel that night, my mind racing with what-ifs and terrifying scenarios. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the relative safety of the motel room. The next day, the police informed me they hadn't found any trace of the person who had chased me. They promised to continue their search, but I knew deep down it was unlikely they would catch them. The forest was vast and unforgiving, a perfect hiding place for someone intent on staying hidden. I returned home, haunted by the events of that night. The tranquility of nature had been shattered by a terrifying encounter that left me shaken to the core. I couldn't bring myself to go camping alone again, the fear of the unknown too overwhelming to ignore. I shared my story online, hoping to warn others of the dangers that could lurk in even the most peaceful of settings. I urged everyone to be vigilant and cautious when venturing into the wilderness alone, emphasizing the importance of safety and preparedness. Months passed, but the memory of that night remained vivid in my mind. I couldn't forget the feeling of being hunted, the terror of knowing someone wanted to harm me. It changed me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. I sought therapy to help me cope with the trauma, to make sense of what had happened and find a way to move forward. Slowly, with time and support, I began to heal. But the scars of that night would always be a part of me. I decided to camp alone in the Smoky Mountains. I wanted some time away from everything, a break from the noise and the stress. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or other campers. It was perfect, just me and nature. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked dinner. The sounds of the forest were comforting, and I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to explore. I hiked all day, taking in the beauty of the mountains, the fresh air, and the solitude. When I returned to my campsite, something felt off. My tent was unzipped, and my supplies were scattered. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but then I noticed footprints. Human footprints. My heart started to race. I checked my belongings and found that some food and a flashlight were missing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker who needed some supplies. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to stay alert and keep my campfire going all night. As darkness fell, the forest seemed different. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. I cracked my flashlight and shone it towards the sound. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed, then hours, but the footsteps didn't return. The next day, I decided to pack up and leave. As I gathered my things, I felt eyes on me. I looked around, but saw no one. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I started hiking back towards my car, keeping a fast pace. After a few hours, I realized I was lost. I had been so distracted by the feeling of being watched that I must have taken a wrong turn. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to set up camp again. I found a small clearing and quickly pitched my tent. I made a small fire and sat close to it, trying to stay calm. As night fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I kept my flashlight and a small knife close by, ready for anything. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, circling my campsite. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, catching a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there, watching me. I shouted, telling them to leave me alone, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and stepped out of my tent. The firelight cast eerie shadows, making it hard to see. I scanned the darkness, my heart racing. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A man, dressed in dirty clothes, with a wild look in his eyes. He stared at me, not moving. I shouted again, telling him to leave, but he just stood there, watching. I backed towards my tent, keeping the flashlight on him. He took a step forward, then another. I knew I had to act. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it at him. He stopped, his eyes widening. For a moment, we stood there, locked in a standoff. Then he turned and ran into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, not sure what to do. I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and started hiking, not caring which direction, just needing to get away. I walked through the night, not stopping until the first light of dawn. Exhausted, I finally found a trail and followed it. Hours later, I stumbled upon a ranger station. I told them everything. They took my report and promised to investigate. I left the mountains that day, vowing never to camp alone again. The feeling of being watched still haunts me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm just grateful I made it out alive. I took the night shift at a remote lodge in Alaska to get away from the chaos of the city. The place was beautiful, surrounded by nothing but snow and trees, and the isolation felt like a blessing. The lodge was old, with creaky floors and dim lighting, but it had a cozy charm. My job was simple: check in guests, manage the front desk, and handle any issues that came up during the night. It was usually quiet. Most guests were there for the solitude and the scenery, and they kept to themselves. I liked the peace. It gave me time to read or just sit by the fire and listen to the wind howling outside. But one night, everything changed. A man checked in late, just before my shift started. He was tall, with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. He wore a thick parka and had a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He didn't make much conversation, just signed the register and took his key. I watched him as he went up the stairs to his room, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something about his eyes, cold and hard, stayed with me. I tried to shake it off and went back to my book, but I couldn't concentrate. Around midnight, the lodge was quiet, and I was alone at the front desk. The wind had picked up outside, making the old building creak. I decided to do a quick round, checking the doors and windows to make sure everything was secure. As I passed by the guest rooms, I heard voices. I stopped and listened. It was coming from the room of the man who had checked in earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of light. I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the crack and saw the man talking on a satellite phone. His voice was low and urgent, and I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was enough to make my skin crawl. He sounded desperate, almost frantic. Then I heard him say, "They'll never find me here. It's too remote." That's when it hit me. He was hiding. From what or whom, I didn't know, but it was clear he didn't want to be found. I backed away quietly and returned to the front desk, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police. But the nearest town was miles away, and there was no cell service out here. The lodge had a landline, but what if he heard me? What if he decided to make sure I couldn't tell anyone? I decided to wait and see if anything else happened. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I spent the next couple of hours on edge, jumping at every little sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. My heart pounded as I looked up and saw the man approaching the front desk. He looked around, his eyes darting nervously, and then he spotted me. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but his eyes were cold. "Just needed some water," he said, holding up an empty bottle. I pointed to the kitchen. "There's a tap in there. Help yourself." He stared at me for a moment longer than necessary, then walked past me into the kitchen. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and glanced around for something I could use as a weapon if I needed to. A few minutes later, he returned, his bottle full. "Thanks," he said, and went back up to his room. I watched him go, every nerve in my body on high alert. I didn't know what to do. I was alone in a remote lodge with a man who was clearly dangerous. I decided to stay behind the desk where I could see both the stairs and the front door. If he tried anything, at least I'd have a chance to react. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the morning to come. Finally, around 6 a.m., the sky started to lighten, and I began to relax a little. At 7 a.m., the morning shift arrived. I quickly pulled my coworker, Sarah, aside and told her what had happened. She agreed that we needed to call the police, but we had to be careful. We went to the office, locked the door, and dialed the local authorities on the landline. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. They said they'd send someone as soon as possible, but it might take a while due to the weather and the distance. In the meantime, we were to stay calm and not confront the man. We returned to the front desk, trying to act normal. The man came down around 8 a.m., looking more relaxed. He even smiled at us as he left for breakfast, which made my skin crawl. Hours passed, and I kept glancing out the window, looking for any sign of the police. Finally, around noon, I saw a snowmobile approaching. 2 officers dismounted and made their way to the lodge. We met them at the door and quickly explained where the man was. They nodded and headed upstairs, one of them signaling for us to stay back. Moments later, we heard a scuffle, then the sound of someone being handcuffed. They brought him down in cuffs, and he glared at me with pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he hissed as they let him out. I felt a surge of relief as the police took him away. Sarah and I looked at each other, both of us shaken but grateful it was over. The police told us later that the man was a wanted criminal, on the run for a series of violent crimes. We'd been lucky. Very lucky. I quit my job at the lodge shortly after that. The peace and quiet I'd once loved now felt tainted. I moved back to the city, where there were people and noise and safety in numbers. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the wind howling outside and remember the cold, hard look in that man's eyes. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard his conversation, if I hadn't called the police. I try not to think about it, but it's a part of me now, a reminder of how close I came to real danger. I always wanted a classic car. It was a dream of mine for years. So, when I found one for sale in Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance. It was a 1967 Mustang, in pretty good shape, and the price was reasonable. The seller, a guy named Mike, seemed nice enough. He was eager to sell and told me he needed the money quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I met Mike at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, but the Mustang was there, gleaming under a layer of dust. We made the deal, and he handed over the keys. I drove the car home, feeling like I had just scored the deal of a lifetime. The first sign of trouble came the next day. I was at a red light when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a guy inside stared at me, hard. I looked away, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. The light turned green, and I drove off quickly, but the SUV followed me for several blocks before finally turning away. That night, I heard noises outside my house. It sounded like someone was messing with the car. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got outside, no one was there. The car was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I was driving to work when the SUV appeared again. This time, it was right on my tail. I tried to lose them, weaving through traffic, but they stayed with me. Finally, I pulled into a crowded parking lot and ran inside a store, hoping they wouldn't follow. They didn't, but when I came back out, there was a note on my windshield. It said, "We know who you are." I decided to call Mike. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times, but no luck. I started to get really worried. That evening, I noticed the SUV parked down the street from my house. They were watching me. The next morning, I found my tires slashed. I called a tow truck and had the car taken to a nearby garage. The mechanic told me it would take a few days to get new tires and fix some other minor issues. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe things would calm down without the car around. But that night, someone broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and footsteps downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs, heart pounding. There were two men in my living room, rummaging through my stuff. They saw me and one of them lunged. I swung the bat, hitting him in the side. He went down, but the other guy pulled a knife. I backed up, trying to keep the bat between us. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I swung the bat again, hitting his arm and knocking the knife away. He tackled me, and we both went down hard. I managed to get on top of him and hit him again until he stopped moving. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes and arrested the two men. I was taken to the hospital, where I got stitches for the cut on my arm. The police questioned me about the men, but I didn't know anything. They took my statement and promised to look into it. A few days later, I got a call from a detective. He told me that the men who broke into my house were part of a gang, and they were looking for something they thought Mike had left in the car. He wouldn't say what, but it sounded serious. The detective advised me to stay somewhere safe until they could sort things out. I stayed with a friend for a while, hoping the police would catch the rest of the gang. They kept the Mustang as evidence, which was fine by me. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Eventually, the police busted the gang, and things started to calm down. They returned the car, but I sold it as soon as I could. I didn't want any more trouble. I moved to a small town in Wisconsin after I retired. The place was quiet, with friendly neighbors and a simple way of life. I spent my days gardening, reading, and walking around the neighborhood. It was a peaceful existence, just what I had been looking for. One day, while walking in the woods behind my house, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned barn. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I decided to take a closer look. As I got nearer, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tire tracks leading up to the barn, and the padlock on the door looked new. I decided to come back later when it was dark, so I wouldn't be seen. That night, I put on my jacket and grabbed a flashlight. I felt a bit nervous, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked through the woods, staying off the main path to avoid being seen. When I reached the barn, I noticed a faint light coming from inside. I crept up to the window and peeked inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were several men inside, packing large plastic bags full of what looked like white powder. There were guns on the table and large stacks of cash. It was clear I had stumbled upon a drug operation. I knew I had to tell someone. The next day, I went to the local police station. I asked to speak to someone in charge and told them everything I had seen. The officer listened but seemed uninterested. He took my statement but didn't seem to take it seriously. I left the station feeling uneasy, but I hoped they would investigate. A few days later, I noticed a black car parked outside my house. It was there every day, just sitting there with tinted windows. I couldn't see inside, but I felt like I was being watched. My phone started ringing at odd hours, and when I answered, no one was there. I began to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, I heard a noise outside my window. I got up and looked out, but I couldn't see anything. Then, I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and went to the front door. I opened it slowly, shining the light outside. No one was there, but there was a note on the ground. It read, "Keep your mouth shut, old man." I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I was in danger. I tried to call the police again, but they dismissed it as a prank. I felt helpless and scared. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I packed a bag with some essentials and decided to leave town for a while. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, hoping to throw them off. I drove to a friend's cabin a few hours away, deep in the woods. I felt safer there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, I heard a car pull up outside. I peeked out the window and saw the same black car. They had found me. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door, running into the woods. I could hear them shouting, their footsteps close behind me. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I tripped over a tree root and fell, scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled to my feet and kept running. I finally saw the lights of a nearby house. I banged on the door, begging for help. An older couple opened the door and let me in. I quickly explained my situation, and they called the police. The men in the black car drove off when they heard the sirens approaching. The police arrived and took my statement. This time, they took me seriously. They investigated the barn and found the drug operation. Several arrests were made, and the drug ring was shut down. The men who had threatened me were caught and taken into custody. I returned to my home in the small town, but things never felt the same. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. The peaceful life I had once enjoyed was gone, replaced by fear and anxiety. But I was safe, and the drug operation was shut down. That was the only comfort I had left. Out in the dense wilderness of the Florida Everglades, my friend and I thought we had found the perfect spot for some stealth camping. It seemed like the ideal escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. Little did we know, our peaceful getaway would soon turn into a nightmare. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness descended upon the swampy landscape, we settled down in our makeshift campsite, surrounded by the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep over us, a feeling that we were not alone in the wilderness. It started with distant noises, faint whispers, and the occasional splash of water in the darkness. At first, we dismissed them as the normal sounds of the Everglades, but as they grew closer and more insistent, we began to realize that something was not right. Then, out of the darkness, emerged a figure, tall and imposing, moving with a stealthy grace that sent shivers down our spines. He approached our campsite with purpose, his eyes glinting in the dim light of our campfire, and we knew in an instant that he was not someone to be trifled with. He introduced himself as a smuggler, using the vast expanse of the Everglades to hide his illicit activities from prying eyes. He warned us to stay out of his way, threatening dire consequences if we dared to interfere with his operations. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. Should we try to reason with him? Or should we make a run for it and hope to escape his clutches? Our minds raced with possibilities as we weighed our options, but in the end, we knew that we were no match for this dangerous man and his criminal enterprise. As the smuggler loomed over us, his presence casting a dark shadow over our campsite, we realized that we had no choice but to comply with his demands. We watched helplessly as he went about his business, moving with a ruthless efficiency that left us feeling powerless and vulnerable. But even as we cowered in fear, a small spark of defiance flickered within us. We refused to let this man intimidate us, to rob us of our freedom and our dignity. And so, when the opportunity presented itself, we seized it with both hands, mustering all of our courage and strength to confront our tormentor head-on. In a moment of desperation, we made a run for it, tearing through the dense underbrush of the Everglades with the smuggler hot on our heels. Adrenaline coursed through our veins as we raced through the darkness, our hearts pounding with fear and determination. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, we stumbled upon a hidden path, leading us to safety and salvation. With renewed energy and resolve, we pushed forward, putting as much distance between us and our pursuer as possible. And then, finally, we saw it, the faint glow of civilization on the horizon, a beacon of hope in the darkness. With one final burst of speed, we sprinted towards it, our lungs burning and our muscles aching, until at last, we reached the safety of civilization. As we collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion, we knew that we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But even as we celebrated our victory, we couldn't shake the feeling that the smuggler was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. And so, as we made our way back to civilization, we vowed to never return to the Everglades again, to put this harrowing ordeal behind us and move on with our lives. I had signed up for a spiritual retreat in the dense forests of Oregon, hoping to find some peace and clarity. The retreat promised a week of meditation, nature walks, and self-discovery, and I was eager to escape the noise of everyday life. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The setting was beautiful, the air crisp and fresh, and the other participants seemed friendly enough. We were a small group, about 10 of us, and our guide, Martin, was this calm, soft-spoken man who seemed to have all the answers. He led us through meditation sessions, guided us on hikes, and spoke about finding inner peace. But as the days went on, I started noticing little things that felt off. The way Martin and some of the others exchanged glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, and the way they seemed to be keeping secrets. One evening, Martin announced that we would have a special ceremony in a clearing deep in the forest. He said it was a tradition of the retreat, something to help us connect with nature and each other. We gathered around a fire as the sun set, the sky turning dark. Martin began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and the others joined in. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. As the chanting grew louder, Martin produced a small vial of liquid and handed it to each of us, saying it would help us see the truth. I hesitated, but everyone else drank it without question. I pretended to drink mine and kept the liquid in my mouth, spitting it out when no one was looking. Almost immediately, the others began to act strange. Their eyes glazed over, and they moved in unison, like they were in a trance. Martin started talking about shedding our old selves and being reborn. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he knew I hadn't drunk the liquid. But then he turned his attention to the others, leading them in a strange dance around the fire. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I slipped away, moving quietly through the trees. The forest was dark and disorienting, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could still hear the chanting, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. After what felt like hours, I found myself at the edge of a small creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. This wasn't just a retreat. It was something much darker. I had to warn the others, get help, but first, I needed to find my way out. I walked through the night, the forest seeming to close in around me. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that Martin or one of the others would appear at any moment. Finally, as dawn broke, I saw a road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I followed the road until I came to a small town. Exhausted and dirty, I found a diner and stumbled inside. The waitress gave me a strange look but brought me a cup of coffee. I asked if there was a police station nearby, and she pointed me in the right direction. The officer on duty listened to my story with a skeptical expression but agreed to send someone to check it out. It took hours for them to find the clearing, and by then, it was empty. The fire was out, and there was no sign of Martin or the others. The officer looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. I knew they were out there, and that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I left Oregon the next day, still shaken and unsure of what I had stumbled into. The experience haunted me, and I couldn't stop thinking about the others. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, or had they moved on to another unsuspecting group? I would never know for sure, but I was grateful to have escaped with my life. Since then, I've been more cautious about where I go and who I trust. The memory of that night in the forest is always with me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I don't know if I'll ever find the peace I was looking for, but I'm thankful just to be alive. Traveling through South America had always been a dream of mine. I had saved up for years and finally took the plunge. I started in Argentina, making my way through Chile, Peru, and then Colombia. Each country had its own charm, and I felt more alive than I had in years. I arrived in Colombia with high spirits. The people were friendly, the food was amazing, and the scenery was breathtaking. I spent a few days in Bogota before heading to Medellin. It was there that I met a group of locals. They seemed nice, always smiling and inviting me to join them for drinks and meals. We quickly became friends. One evening, they suggested a trip to a secluded part of the jungle. They said it was a hidden gem, a place tourists never see. They promised waterfalls, exotic wildlife, and an authentic experience. I was hesitant but also intrigued. I agreed to go. We set out early the next morning. The group consisted of Juan, the leader, along with Carlos, Maria, and a few others. They seemed excited and kept the mood light with jokes and laughter. We took a jeep deep into the jungle, far from any towns or cities. The road was rough, but the scenery was beautiful. After a few hours, we arrived at a small clearing. Juan said we would need to hike the rest of the way. We grabbed our backpacks and set off on foot. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but Juan assured us it was the right way. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The jungle was dense, and the sounds of wildlife were all around us. We walked for what felt like hours. The sun was starting to set, and I was beginning to worry. I asked Juan how much farther it was, and he just smiled and said we were close. We finally reached a small campsite with a few makeshift huts. Juan said this was where we would spend the night. As we settled in, I noticed that Carlos and Maria were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in my direction. My unease grew, but I tried to shake it off. We sat around a campfire, and one passed around a bottle of local liquor. I took a sip, but my nerves were too frayed to enjoy it. When it got dark, the atmosphere changed. Juan's friendly demeanor vanished. He and the others became quiet, almost tense. I felt trapped. Suddenly, Juan stood up and walked over to me. He looked down with a cold, hard stare. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and threatening. Before I could react, Carlos and another man grabbed me, forcing me to my feet. They dragged me to one of the huts and threw me inside. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. They locked the door from the outside, leaving me in darkness. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. I tried to think of a way out. The walls of the hut were thin, made of wooden planks. I started to kick at them, hoping to break through. After several tries, one of the planks gave way, creating a small hole. I squeezed through, scratching my arms and tearing my shirt. Once outside, I saw that the campfire was still burning, but the group was nowhere in sight. I needed to get away fast. I remembered the trail we took and decided to follow it back. I ran through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of the night were deafening. I stumbled over roots and rocks, cutting my hands and knees. I heard voices behind me, shouting in Spanish. They were coming after me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain and fear. I had to find the jeep and get out of there. The jungle seemed endless, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the clearing ahead. The jeep was still there, parked where we left it. I reached the jeep and yanked the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. I jumped in and started the engine, praying it would start. The jeep roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw Juan and the others burst from the trees, shouting and waving their arms. They were too late. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to slow down until I was far away. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the police. They took my statement and sent officers to the jungle, but I never found out what happened to Juan and his group. I left Colombia the next day, shaken but relieved to be alive. The experience haunts me to this day. I had trusted those people, thinking they were friends. It was a harsh lesson about trust and the dangers that can lurk behind friendly faces. I was driving through the mountains of Colorado when the storm hit. The sky turned dark and rain started pouring down in heavy sheets. I could barely see the road in front of me. I had a GPS, but it kept losing signal. I needed to get to my cabin before nightfall, so I decided to take a shortcut I saw on the map. The shortcut was a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The rain made it slippery and dangerous, but I pushed on, hoping it would save me time. The trees on either side were thick and tall, blocking out what little light was left. It felt like I was driving into a tunnel of darkness. Suddenly, my car hit something, and I skidded to a stop. I got out to check and saw a fallen tree blocking the road. The rain was relentless, and I was drenched within seconds. There was no way around it, and I couldn't move the tree by myself. I was stranded. I decided to wait out the storm in the car, hoping someone would come by. I got back in, locked the doors, and tried to calm down. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. My phone had no signal, and the battery was running low. I felt completely isolated. As night fell, the rain finally started to ease. The darkness outside was complete, and the only light came from my car's interior. I was about to try and get some sleep when I saw movement outside. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there, watching me. I strained to see through the rain-streaked windows but could only make out a vague shape. It seemed to be moving closer. Panic set in, and I started the car, hoping to at least turn on the headlights to see better. The car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. The figure outside moved closer, and I could see it was a man. He was tall and wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in the shadows. He stopped a few feet from the car and just stood there, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use the flashlight as a weapon if needed. The man started tapping on the window, slowly at first, then harder. The sound was unnerving in the silence. I tried to shout at him to go away, but my voice was shaky and weak. He leaned closer to the window, and I could see his face. It was pale and twisted into a malicious grin. He mouthed something, but I couldn't make it out. I locked eyes with him, my mind racing with fear. I had to get out of there. I grabbed the door handle on the passenger side and threw it open, running into the dark forest. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, but the ground was muddy and difficult to navigate. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and determined. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees were thick, and I kept tripping over roots and branches. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I glanced back and saw his silhouette moving quickly, getting closer. I stumbled into a clearing and saw a small cabin in the distance. It was dark, but it was my only hope. I sprinted towards it, praying the door would be open. I reached it and turned the handle. It was unlocked. I rushed inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The cabin was old and dusty, with minimal furniture. I found a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would hold. I tried to catch my breath, listening for any sign of a man. The only sound was the rain and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, then an hour. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had lost him. But then I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the porch. He had found me. My heart raced again, and I looked around for something to defend myself with. There was an old fireplace poker in the corner. I grabbed it and stood ready. The doorknob rattled, and the door creaked as he pushed against it. The chair held, but I knew it wouldn't for long. He started pounding on the door, the wood splintering under the force. I backed away, holding the poker tightly, my hands shaking. The door burst open, and he stepped inside, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't say a word, just smiled that same twisted smile. I swung the poker, but he caught it, wrenching it from my hands. He threw it aside and advanced on me. I backed into a corner, trapped. He reached out, and I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. Suddenly, I heard a shout from outside. The man turned, and I saw headlights through the broken door. Another car had pulled up, and someone was yelling. The man hesitated, then turned and ran out the back of the cabin. I stayed frozen in place until a man and woman entered, their flashlights sweeping the room. They saw me and rushed over, asking if I was okay. I could barely speak, just nodded. They called the police, and I finally felt a sense of relief wash over me. The authorities arrived and took my statement, but the man was long gone. They promised to search the area, but I knew he was already far away. I never found out who he was or why he was out there. I just knew I was lucky to be alive. That night changed me forever. I never take shortcuts, and I always make sure my car is in perfect condition before any trip. The memory of his twisted smile still haunts me, but I know I'll never let my guard down again. I was driving through New Mexico, heading back home after visiting my sister. The roads were empty, and the vast desert stretched out endlessly on either side. It was peaceful, in a way, but also a bit eerie. I had been driving for hours and still had a long way to go. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, I noticed a group of bikers in my rearview mirror. There were about 6 of them, and they were writing information, looking like something out of a movie. At first, I didn't think much of it. Bikers traveled these roads all the time. After a while, though, they started getting closer. I could hear the roar of their engines growing louder. They spread out, some riding beside me, some behind. It felt like they were surrounding my car. I glanced over at one of the bikers and saw him staring right back at me, a smirk on his face. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to keep calm and focus on the road, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The bikers began to weave in and out of their formation, coming closer to my car. One of them revved his engine loudly, making me jump. I decided to speed up a little, hoping to put some distance between us. But they matched my speed easily. One of them pulled up beside my window and shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise of the engines. He laughed and sped ahead, the others following. For a moment, I thought they were leaving me alone. But then they slowed down, forcing me to slow down too. I was trapped in the middle of them, my heart pounding. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. The bikers continued to toy with me, speeding up and slowing down, getting dangerously close to my car. I could see their faces now, grinning and menacing. They were enjoying this, whatever this was. I felt a rising sense of panic. I had to do something. I remembered seeing a gas station a few miles back and decided to head there. I hoped there would be people around, someone who could help. I took the next exit and headed towards the gas station, praying the bikers wouldn't follow. But they did. As I pulled into the gas station, the bikers surrounded my car again. There was no one else in sight, and the place looked deserted. My heart sank. I was on my own. I parked near the entrance and quickly got out of the car, trying to act like I wasn't scared out of my mind. The bikers dismounted and followed me, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of them, a tall guy with a beard and a leather jacket, stepped forward. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You lost or something?" I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "Just getting gas." I walked towards the entrance of the gas station, but he grabbed my arm, stopping me. His grip was strong, and I could feel his callous fingers digging into my skin. "Not so fast," he said, pulling me closer. The other bikers laughed. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to get away. I yanked my arm free and made a run for it, heading towards the back of the gas station. I could hear them chasing after me, their boots pounding on the ground. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I spotted a narrow alley between the gas station and an old storage building. I squeezed through, hoping they wouldn't be able to follow. But they did. I could hear them shouting, their voices echoing off the walls. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I reached the end of the alley and found myself in an open field, nowhere to hide. I had to keep running. The bikers were gaining on me. I could feel their presence behind me, closing in. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to keep going. Suddenly, I saw a car coming down the road in the distance. It was my only hope. I ran towards it, waving my arms and shouting for help. The bikers were right behind me, but I didn't look back. I focused on the car, willing it to see me. The car slowed down as it got closer, and I saw a man inside, looking confused. I ran up to the driver's side window, pounding on it and begging for help. The man looked at me, then at the bikers approaching, and his eyes widened. He unlocked the door, and I jumped in, slamming it shut behind me. "Drive!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The man didn't hesitate. He hit the gas, and we sped away, leaving the bikers behind. I glanced back and saw them standing there, looking furious. The man drove for a while before finally pulling over. He asked me what had happened, and I told him everything, my voice trembling. He offered to take me to the nearest police station, and I gratefully accepted. I knew I couldn't stay out here on my own. At the police station, I filed a report and gave them a description of the bikers. They said they would look into it, but I didn't have much hope. I was just glad to be safe. The man who had helped me offered to drive me the rest of the way to my destination, and I thanked him, feeling a bit more at ease. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had settled in my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the bikers to appear again. But they didn't. I finally reached my destination and thanked the man profusely for his help. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bikers' faces, heard their laughter. I knew it would take a long time to get over what had happened, but I was grateful to be alive. I decided to be more careful in the future, to trust my instincts and never stop for strangers again. I was in my apartment, alone, during a citywide blackout caused by a raging storm. The darkness was suffocating, enveloping everything in its thick embrace. The only sound was the howling wind outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to break in. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in terror, not knowing what to do. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely vulnerable in the darkness. I had to think fast, to find a way to protect myself from whoever was trying to get inside. My mind raced with fear, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was the impending danger. I groped around in the darkness, searching desperately for something, anything, that I could use as a weapon. My hands closed around a heavy lamp, and I clutched it tightly, ready to defend myself if the intruder managed to break through the door. The pounding on the door grew louder and more frantic, and I could hear the sound of splintering wood as they tried to force their way in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick with fear. But then, suddenly, the pounding stopped, and there was nothing but silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. I stood there in the darkness, trembling with fear, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I try to find a way out of the apartment? I didn't know, and the uncertainty only made my fear worse. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the pounding started again, louder and more ferocious than before. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever was on the other side of that door was not going to give up easily. I backed away from the door, clutching the lamp tightly in my trembling hands. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped and helpless in the face of impending danger. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of voices outside. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help had finally arrived. The police had come to rescue me from whatever nightmare I had found myself in. I rushed to the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the hallway. The police were there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. They quickly subdued the intruder, leading them away in handcuffs. I stood there in the hallway, shaking with relief, grateful to be alive. It was over, the nightmare was finally over, and I was safe once again. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the terrifying darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our everyday lives. I had been working the graveyard shift at the diner for about 6 months. The hours were long and the pay wasn't great, but it was a job. The place was usually quiet at night, mostly truckers and night owls stopping by for a quick meal. I liked the solitude and the routine. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., when a group of 5 men walked in. They were loud, laughing and talking in hushed tones that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They looked out of place, dressed too nicely for our little diner. I put on my best smile and walked over to their table with a notepad. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" I asked. They barely glanced at the menu. "Coffee, and keep it coming," one of them said. His voice was sharp, commanding. The others nodded in agreement. I poured their coffee and went back to the counter, keeping an eye on them. They seemed restless, looking around the diner as if expecting someone. The atmosphere felt tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, they started to get more aggressive. They laughed louder, made crude jokes, and began harassing the other customers. A couple at a nearby table tried to ignore them, but the men wouldn't leave them alone. One of the men, the one who had ordered the coffee, got up and walked over to the couple. "You two having a nice night?" he asked, his tone mocking. The couple looked uncomfortable, and the man put his arm around the woman, pulling her closer. I knew I had to do something. I walked over and tried to intervene. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave them alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, a cold smile on his face. "Or what?" he asked, taking a step closer. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Or I'll call the police," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. He laughed. "Go ahead. I'd love to see them try and do something about it." The other men at the table laughed too, egging him on. I backed away, my heart pounding. I went to the counter and picked up the phone, dialing 911. As the phone rang, I saw one of the men stand up and walk towards me. I turned away, hoping the police would answer quickly. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator said. I spoke quickly, trying to keep my voice low. "I'm at the diner on Route 5. There's a group of men here harassing customers. I need help." The man was getting closer. I turned to face him, holding the phone tightly. "Put the phone down," he said, his voice cold. I did as he said, my hands shaking. The operator was still on the line, but I couldn't speak. The man leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine. "You're making a big mistake," he said. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. He stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked back to his table. I picked up the phone again, whispering to the operator, "Please hurry." The men continued their harassment, and I tried to keep the other customers calm. The couple eventually left, clearly frightened. It was just me and the group of men now. One of them got up and walked over to the jukebox, putting on some loud, thumping music. They started to dance, their movements erratic and wild. I stood behind the counter, watching them and praying the police would arrive soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car outside. The men didn't seem to notice. I ran to the door and waved the officers in. They walked in, and the mood in the diner shifted instantly. The men stopped dancing and turned to face the officers. "Is there a problem here?" one of the officers asked. The man who had threatened me earlier stepped forward. "No problem, officer. We're just having a good time." The officer looked at me, and I nodded slightly, letting him know that wasn't true. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the officer said. The men grumbled but didn't argue. They slowly made their way out of the diner, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders. As soon as they were gone, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers stayed for a while, making sure everything was okay. I thanked them profusely, my hands still shaking. They told me to call if anything like that ever happened again, and left. I sat down at the counter, trying to calm my nerves. The diner was quiet again, but the tension lingered in the air. I stayed on edge for the rest of my shift, jumping at every little noise. The night dragged on, and I couldn't wait for the morning to come. When my replacement finally arrived, I was exhausted but relieved. I told her what had happened, and she gave me a sympathetic look. "You did the right thing," she said. "I'm glad you're okay." I nodded, still feeling uneasy. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the men and how quickly things had escalated. I hoped I'd never have to deal with something like that again. The quiet of the night shift was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. When I got home, I collapsed into bed, too tired to even eat. I lay there in the dark, replaying the events of the night in my mind. I knew I'd never forget the look in that man's eyes or the way my heart had pounded in my chest. The graveyard shift would never feel the same again. I was cruising through the desert, just me and the open road stretching out before me. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage. I hadn't seen another car for miles, so when I spotted a minivan pulled over on the side of the road, I figured they must be in trouble. I slowed down and pulled up behind them, rolling down my window to see if they needed help. A man stepped out from the driver's seat, waving me over with a grateful smile. He looked to be in his 40s, with a tired expression and a dusty hat pulled low over his eyes. As I approached, he explained that their minivan had broken down, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. He gestured towards the vehicle, where a woman and 2 children sat waiting in the shade of a nearby rock. Without hesitation, I offered to help. I had a toolbox in the back of my truck, and I figured I could at least take a look and see if I could get their engine running again. The man thanked me profusely, relief evident in his voice. I popped the hood and got to work, tinkering with the engine while the family watched anxiously from the shade. It didn't take long for me to diagnose the problem, a loose wire that had come disconnected. I quickly fixed it and slammed the hood shut, wiping my hands on my jeans. The man was overjoyed, shaking my hand and thanking me again and again. He insisted that I join them for dinner as a way of saying thanks, and though I was hesitant at first, I eventually agreed. After all, it was the least I could do. We piled into their minivan and set off down the road, the sun sinking lower in the sky. As we drove, the man made small talk, asking me about my life and where I was headed. I answered politely, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We eventually arrived at their home, a rundown farmhouse nestled in the desert. It looked like something out of a horror movie, with peeling paint and broken windows. But I brushed off my unease, chalking it up to nerves. The man led me inside, where the smell of cooking food wafted through the air. The woman and children were waiting for us at the table, their smiles wide and welcoming. But as I took my seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we ate, the conversation turned to strange topics, things that didn't make sense in polite company. The man talked about his past, about how he had lost everything and had to start over from scratch. The woman and children sat in silence, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to make excuses and leave, but the man insisted that I stay the night. He said it wasn't safe to drive in the dark, and that I could sleep on the couch until morning. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out while I still could. That night, I lay awake on the couch, the sound of the wind howling outside the only thing keeping me company. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong, that I was in danger. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it, the sound of footsteps creeping down the hallway towards me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen for any sign of danger. And that's when I saw them, the man, the woman, and the children, standing in the doorway, their eyes gleaming with malice. They were no longer the grateful family I had met on the side of the road. They were something else entirely, something dark and twisted. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With a surge of adrenaline, I leaped off the couch and bolted for the door, ignoring their shouts and cries behind me. I sprinted through the darkness, the desert stretching out before me like an endless expanse of nothingness. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, panting and gasping for breath. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys and started the engine, tearing out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back as I drove, the fear and adrenaline fueling my every move. And as the farmhouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew that I had narrowly escaped the clutches of something unspeakably evil. But the memory of that night would haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the most unexpected of places. Picture this, I'm on this backpacking trip through Europe, just trying to see as much of the continent as I can. I've been traveling for weeks, hopping from one city to the next, and everything's been going great so far. But then I decide to take this detour through the countryside of Eastern Europe. I mean, I've heard it's beautiful out here, with all the rolling hills and quaint little villages. So I figure, why not check it out? I'm dragging along these winding roads, just enjoying the scenery, when suddenly I realize that I have no idea where I am. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way, because none of this looks familiar. I start to panic a little. I mean, I'm out here all alone, with no cell service and no way to contact anyone for help. But then I see this village up ahead, nestled in a valley between the hills, and I figure maybe I can stop there and ask for directions. As I get closer, though, I start to get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. I mean, the village looks deserted, there's not a soul in sight, no cars parked on the streets, nothing. But I figure, what the hell, I've got nothing to lose, right? So I pull into the village square and park my car, and I get out to take a look around. The first thing I notice is how quiet it is. I mean, there's no birds chirping, no dogs barking, nothing. It's like the whole place is dead silent. I start walking down the street, calling out for anyone who might be around, but there's still no answer. It's like the village is completely abandoned, like everyone just up and left in the middle of the night. But then, just as I'm starting to get really creeped out, I hear this sound coming from one of the houses. It's like a faint scratching noise, like someone's trying to get out. I follow the sound to this old, rundown cottage at the edge of the village, and I can see that the door is cracked open just a little bit. I don't know why, but something compels me to go inside. I mean, I figure maybe someone's in trouble, and they need my help. So I push open the door and step inside, and that's when I see them, these people, huddled together in the corner of the room, their eyes wide with fear. I try to ask them what's wrong, but they just stare at me like I'm some kind of monster. And that's when I notice something else. There's this smell in the air, this sickly sweet smell that makes my stomach churn. I realize that something's not right here, that maybe I should get out while I still can. But before I can even turn around, I hear this voice behind me, low and menacing. I spin around, and there's this guy standing in the doorway, blocking my only way out. He's tall and lean, with this wild look in his eyes that makes my blood run cold. He starts talking to me, but I can't even make out what he's saying. It's like his words are coming from some other place, some other time, and all I can focus on is the fear twisting in my gut. I try to run, but he's faster than me, and before I know it, he's grabbed me by the arm and dragged me out of the cottage and into the street. I struggle against him, but he's too strong, and soon I'm surrounded by these other people, all of them staring at me with those same wide, terrified eyes. I realize then that I'm in serious trouble, that these people aren't going to let me go without a fight. And that's when I know I have to do something, anything, to get out of here alive. So I fight, with everything I've got, lashing out at my captors with fists and feet, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. And somehow, against all odds, I break free. I push past them and run as fast as I can, not stopping until I'm back at my car, with the engine running and the tires squealing as I peel out of that cursed village and back onto the open road. I don't know what happened to those people, or why they were so hell-bent on keeping me there. But I do know one thing: I'll never forget the terror of that day, the feeling of being hunted like an animal in the dead of night. And I'll never take another solo road trip through the countryside of Eastern Europe again. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain pounded on the roof like it was trying to break in, and the wind howled through the trees. I was alone in my farmhouse, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving me in the dim glow of candles scattered around the living room. I was reading a book, trying to ignore the creepy sounds outside when I heard it, a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here in this weather? I got up slowly, feeling uneasy, and walked to the door. When I opened it, a man stood there, drenched to the bone. He looked harmless enough, but something about him made me nervous. "My car broke down," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Can I come in and use your phone?" I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. But I didn't want to be heartless. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He thanked me and stepped into the hallway, water dripping from his clothes. I pointed to the phone in the kitchen. "It's over there. Help yourself." He nodded and walked in that direction, and I followed him, trying to shake off the bad feeling in my gut. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. As he talked, I noticed him glancing around, taking in the details of my house. "Thanks for letting me in," he said, hanging up the phone. "My name's David, by the way." "Emma," I replied, still feeling uneasy. "Did you get through to someone?" "Yeah, my friend will be here in about an hour," he said. "Mind if I wait here?" I didn't like the idea, but what choice did I have? "Sure, make yourself comfortable," I said, trying to sound more at ease than I felt. He sat on the couch, and I offered him a towel, which he accepted gratefully. We made small talk for a bit. He seemed normal enough, but then he started saying things that set off alarm bells. "You've got a really nice place here," he said, looking around. "I've always liked old farmhouses like this. Your family must have had it for generations." My blood ran cold. How did he know that? "Yeah," I said cautiously. "It was my grandparents." He nodded, like he already knew. "I bet it has some interesting stories," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made me feel like he could see right through me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, it does. But it's just me here now." David's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That must get lonely sometimes." I felt a chill run down my spine. Not really. I lied. I like the peace and quiet. He leaned back, seeming too comfortable. You must be really brave, living out here all alone. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I stood up, needing to put some distance between us. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, tea? Coffee would be great, he said, his eyes following me as I moved to the kitchen. I started the coffee maker, my mind racing. I needed to get him out of here. When I turned back, he was standing in the doorway, watching me. You've got a lot of family photos, he said, nodding toward the hallway where the pictures hung. Yeah, I said, my voice tight. Lots of memories. He stepped closer, and I fought the urge to back away. It's funny, he said softly. I feel like I know this place. Like I've been here before. My heart was pounding now. Maybe you drove by sometime, I said, trying to sound casual. Maybe, he said, but his smile told me he didn't believe it. Or maybe it's just so welcoming. I forced a laugh. Yeah, I guess so. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured him a cup, my hand shaking slightly. As I handed it to him, he grabbed my wrist. Thanks, Emma, he said, his grip tightening. You're really kind. I pulled my hand away, my heart racing. You're welcome, I said, stepping back. Your friend should be here soon. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. I hope so, he said. I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome. I smiled, but inside I was panicking. I needed to get him out of here. You know, the storm's letting up, I said. Maybe you should wait outside, so you don't miss your friend. He didn't move. It's still pretty rough out there, he said. I'm sure you don't mind me staying a bit longer. I was running out of options. Actually, I do, I said, trying to sound firm. I'm really tired and need to get some sleep. He put down the coffee cup and stood up, his smile gone. That's too bad, he said, his voice low. I was hoping we could get to know each other better. Fear shot through me. Please, just go, I said, my voice shaking. He took a step toward me, and I backed up until I hit the counter. Emma, don't be like that, he said, his eyes cold. We were just starting to have fun. I grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it between us. Get out, I said, my voice steady now. He raised his hands, smirking. Okay. No need for that. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I followed him to the door, the knife still in my hand. Go, I said again. He opened the door and stepped outside, the rain still pouring down. I'll be seeing you, Emma, he said, his voice a chilling promise. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I watched through the window as he walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid he might come back. When morning finally came, I called the police and told them everything. They promised to keep an eye on the area, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. That night changed everything. I wasn't just a farmer living in a quiet old house anymore. I was a survivor, and I would never let my guard down again. I was hiking near an old mine in Nevada, just trying to get away for a bit. The area was remote, quiet, and perfect for clearing my head. I'd always been drawn to places like this, places that felt untouched and wild. The sky was clear, and the sun was bright, making the barren landscape look almost beautiful. I had heard about the mine from some locals in a small town nearby. They said it had been abandoned for years, a relic from the gold rush days. I was curious, so I decided to check it out. The entrance was easy to find, a dark hole in the side of a rocky hill. I had a flashlight with me, just in case I felt brave enough to go inside. Standing at the entrance, I hesitated. It was dark and cool inside, a stark contrast to the hot desert sun. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my flashlight and stepped in. The walls were rough, and the air was stale. It smelled like dust and old, wet rock. The tunnels were narrow and twisted, and I had to move carefully. My footsteps echoed, making me feel like I wasn't alone. I kept going, deeper into the mine, fascinated by how silent it was. After a while, I came across a wider area, a sort of open chamber. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. There were supplies scattered around, canned food, water bottles, a sleeping bag. It looked like someone was living here. My heart started pounding. This wasn't just an abandoned mine. Someone had turned it into a hideout. I turned off my flashlight and stood still, listening. That's when I heard footsteps, coming from deeper in the mine. They were slow and deliberate, getting closer. I panicked and ducked behind a large rock, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, afraid to move. A man walked into the chamber. He was tall, with a rough beard and dirty clothes. He looked like he hadn't seen a shower in weeks. He carried a gun. I realized I was in serious danger. This wasn't just some homeless guy. He was hiding out for a reason. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't let him see me. I waited until he turned and walked back the way he came. Slowly, I started to move, staying low and close to the walls. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the way out. The tunnels all looked the same, and in my panic, I took a wrong turn. I found myself in a dead-end tunnel. I turned around, hoping to find another way, but then I heard the man's voice. He was talking to someone, maybe on a radio. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. He was saying something about needing more supplies and that he'd be moving soon. I couldn't hear the response, but it was clear he was not alone. The thought of more people like him made my blood run cold. I had to find a way out before they found me. I moved quietly, trying to retrace my steps. I kept my flashlight off, relying on my memory and the faint light filtering in from somewhere. The mine felt like a maze, and every step I took made me more anxious. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead. The exit. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I moved faster, but still quietly. As I got closer to the exit, I heard the man's footsteps again, this time quicker, more urgent. He was coming back. I darted into a side tunnel, hoping he wouldn't see me. He passed by, muttering to himself. I waited until his footsteps faded, then made my move. I ran towards the exit, not caring about the noise anymore. I just needed to get out. Bursting into the sunlight felt like a rebirth. I didn't stop running until I was far from the mine. My heart was still racing, and my mind was spinning. I looked back, half expecting to see him following me, but there was no one there. I made my way back to town as quickly as I could. I found the local sheriff and told him everything. He listened, his face growing serious. He said they had been looking for a fugitive in the area, a dangerous man wanted for several crimes. They organized a search team and went to the mine, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. He had left behind his supplies, but there was no sign of him. The sheriff thanked me for the information and told me to stay out of the area for my own safety. The experience shook me. I had always loved exploring, but now I was more cautious. The memory of that dark mine and the man with the gun stayed with me. I knew I had been lucky to escape. From then on, I made sure to tell someone where I was going and always carried a phone with me. Exploring was still a passion of mine, but I respected the dangers more. The world is full of hidden places, and not all of them are safe. I learned that the hard way. But I was alive, and that was what mattered. We decided to go camping by the river in Alaska, away from everything. There were 4 of us: Sarah, my boyfriend Mark, our friend Jess, and me. We packed up all our gear and drove out to the site we had picked on the map. It was a beautiful spot, right by the water, with the mountains in the distance. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for what we thought would be a great weekend. The first night was perfect. We cooked dinner over the fire, laughed, and told stories. The stars were so clear, and the sound of the river was soothing. We all felt a sense of peace that only being out in nature can bring. We stayed up late, enjoying each other's company, and finally went to bed feeling content and safe. The next morning, we woke up to find fresh tracks near our campsite. They weren't from animals, but from people. It was unsettling, but we didn't think too much of it. We figured it might be other campers or hunters passing through. After breakfast, we decided to go for a hike along the river. We had been walking for about an hour when we heard voices ahead of us. As we rounded a bend, we saw a group of 3 men. They looked like hunters, dressed in camouflage with rifles slung over their shoulders. At first, they seemed friendly enough, waving and greeting us. We chatted for a bit, and they asked us where we were camping. When we told them, their demeanor changed. They started asking more questions, their tone becoming more aggressive. They asked if we had seen any game and mentioned that they had been hunting in this area for years. It felt like they were trying to intimidate us, making it clear that they considered this their territory. We decided to head back to our camp. As we walked away, I could feel their eyes on us, and it made my skin crawl. We didn't talk much on the way back, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we got back to the campsite, we discussed what had happened. Mark suggested we stay alert but not let it ruin our trip. We tried to shake off the encounter and enjoy the rest of the day. That evening, as we were sitting around the fire, we heard footsteps approaching. The same 3 hunters emerged from the darkness, their expressions even more menacing than before. They stood at the edge of our campsite, staring at us. One of them spoke up, saying we needed to leave, that this was their hunting ground. Mark tried to reason with them, explaining that we were just camping for the weekend and would be gone soon. But they wouldn't listen. They kept insisting that we pack up and leave immediately. The tension was palpable, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Jess, trying to defuse the situation, offered them some food and coffee. They reluctantly accepted and sat down by the fire, but their presence was unsettling. They ate in silence, watching us with cold, calculating eyes. After what felt like an eternity, they got up and left without a word. We stayed up late that night, too scared to sleep. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every little sound. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt ominous and threatening. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to figure out what we had done to provoke them. The next day, we decided it was best to leave. We started packing up our gear, constantly looking over our shoulders. Just as we were finishing, the hunters returned. This time, they didn't bother with pleasantries. They told us to leave and not come back, their voices low and dangerous. We hurried to load our gear into the car, but as we did, one of the hunters grabbed Jess's arm. Mark stepped in, telling him to let go, but the hunter just tightened his grip. I could see the fear in Jess's eyes, and my own panic rising. Mark managed to pull Jess free, and we all jumped into the car. As we drove away, The hunters stood watching us, their expressions angry and menacing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. The drive back was silent. We were all too shaken to talk. When we finally reached the nearest town, we went straight to the police. We told them what had happened, but there wasn't much they could do. The hunters hadn't technically broken any laws, and we didn't have any proof of their threats. We ended up cutting our trip short and heading home. The experience left a mark on all of us. The memory of those hunters, their cold eyes and threatening words, still haunts me. I've always loved camping, but now, the thought of going back into the wilderness fills me with a sense of dread.